This is Grotesquerie, a science fiction mystery by A.I.I.D. Chapter 1. Lauren's nerves hummed with anxiety as she awaited the signal from her senior partner, Felix, who would indicate when it was time to act. This was the most exciting thing to happen to her since she had become a full agent 6 months ago after graduation, but it was also nerve-wracking to wait, unsure of the outcome. This was the third attempt by the Alien Immigration and Integration Department to bust the exchange of illegal alien technology with Earth gangs and other criminals. During the previous 2 busts, when agents had managed to learn the location in advance, the first one had never taken place, and during the second, everyone had escaped. "We're going to get them this time," said Felix Renton, the senior agent in charge. His words were quiet in her ear, since he had whispered into his mouthpiece. He was crouched beside her, so she simply nodded to indicate she agreed. She certainly hoped they caught the aliens responsible this time, because local and federal law enforcement officers were becoming overrun and outgunned with the extra advantage the criminals received from the unapproved and unauthorized alien technology they were buying on the black market. The Alien Immigration and Integration Department occasionally authorized the slow release of alien technology, masqueraded as a human breakthrough, but they were cautious about such things. Apparently, someone wanted to circumvent official channels and cash in on the massive profits awaiting, and they didn't care to whom they sold their potentially dangerous technology. They had to be stopped, and the aliens responsible would be banished from Earth, either deported back to their home planets, or in the case where there was no home planet remaining, to Terria 7, an inhospitable planet the Terrians leased to Earth for just such a purpose. Realizing her thoughts were distracting her from the mission at hand, Lauren cleared her mind and focused, waiting for the signal. From her nook, she observed the arrival of 2 groups. One was clearly human, dressed in leather and carrying guns she knew were already illegal, and they were simply human weapons. The thought of such a group coming into possession of the type of alien technology that had been flooding the market was chilling. The second group wore heavy robes that obscured their faces, and they were of disparate sizes. Some were smaller, far shorter than the average human, or around human height. She thought she recognized an annulier when one of the group's hoods shifted, since its bulbous head and protruding eyes affixed to stalks were distinctive to that race. 2 of the group were hulking behemoths, standing close to 8 feet tall. She couldn't be certain with the robes obscuring them, but judging from their build, she thought they were Tardos. She shuddered at the thought of facing one. Not only were they massively built and incredibly strong, but they had a thick exoskeleton with a composition roughly equivalent to cement. Their main weakness was sound, so she was certain the department would have brought at least a few ultra-low-frequency weapons. They would need the ULF guns if they turned out to be Tartos and did not surrender. And when did a Tartos ever surrender? The agents observing from the shadows waited until 3 of the aliens, if they were aliens, dragged forth a huge crate. 2 of the humans from the buyer's group stepped forward to meet them in the middle, and they seemed pleased by whatever the lid moving off the crate revealed. There was some discussion, and what appeared to be some bartering, but eventually the humans handed over a heavy bag. "Now," said Felix, which was the signal for all the agents to come out of their hiding places and surround the aliens. Lauren's training, simulations and mental practicing hadn't prepared her for the reality of a sting operation. It was literal chaos for a few moments, despite the team moving as one coordinated, well-oiled machine. Aliens and humans fled, with agents in pursuit. In the scuffle, at least none of the humans had managed to acquire the crate they had purchased, though she saw no evidence that any of the humans had been apprehended. It was far more likely the agents would have focused on the aliens anyway, and left the humans to the FBI. The department often worked in cooperation with other human-focused agencies, when alien matters touched upon human criminal activity. As things calmed down, she was disappointed to discover most of the aliens, including the Tardos, had escaped. Everything had happened so quickly that she hadn't even had a chance to identify a target to pursue. "We have one," said Felix. Lauren joined the exodus of agents that surrounded Felix and another agent, where they knelt on the ground by an injured alien. She tentatively identified it as a she-boar, but it was smaller than she would have expected for that species. That indicated it was a little more than an adolescent, and her anger stirred at the aliens who had dragged a child into the seedy underworld. The she-boar was clearly fatally injured, but his lips were moving. Felix and Agent Wilkes bent closer, getting nearer to the adolescent's mouth. Felix's lips tightened a moment later. When he lifted his head, the she-boar drew its last breath. "What did he say?" asked Agent Turner, his gaze on Felix instead of Agent Wilkes. "He gave me a name. Kerr Dracos." Lauren jerked with surprise. Even though she'd only been a full agent for 6 months, she recognized the Dracos name. Kerr Dracos was almost a legend among the agents. She had never met him, but she knew he was in good standing with the department, and he wielded a fair amount of power in his own right. If this Kex was related to the Dracos family in some fashion, it could be a scandal, and a real embarrassment to the family. They would have to approach the Dracos family with sensitivity and care. Or they could burst into the Grotesquerie, which was the traveling show the Dracos family owned, and how they earned their money on Earth. It wasn't Lauren's call, but she certainly wouldn't have made such a big production of it, by storming the Grotesquerie and hauling out the brother of one of the most influential aliens on Earth in handcuffs for everyone to see. Despite her disapproval of the operation, she was temporarily sidetracked by her fascination at her first in-person glimpse of a Dragoran. That wasn't their actual name, since it was unpronounceable to humans, but it was the species name the department had assigned them when the first refugee ship came to Earth. It was easy to see where the inspiration for the name had come from. Kex was about 6 feet tall, with a lean physique, though his shoulders suggested those muscles received a lot of exercise. No doubt, that came from when he used the wings currently folded neatly against his back. Only the clawed extensions rising from the midpoint to rest above his shoulders really showed from her vantage point. Those extrusions couldn't be tucked away. His body was faintly purple, and his hair was a dark purple color, so deep as to be almost black. His wings were also that deep purple color, but other than a slight leathery look to them, his skin was smooth everywhere. During her training, she'd seen a variety of aliens, some with tentacles and some with scales, but few had perfectly uniform-colored smooth skin like the Dragorans. They had the kind of complexion teenage girls would kill for. All in all, he was a striking specimen, even subdued in handcuffs and looking bewildered by what was unfolding. He was clearly saying something to the agents pulling him toward the van assigned for his arrest, but she was too far away to hear what he was saying. "No wonder the Dracos family is so wealthy," said Felix with a hint of bitterness as he came up to stand beside her. "If they've been selling illegal technology, it all makes sense. They're wealthy." She looked around her, surprised by that information. Granted, they had interrupted the setup of the Grotesquerie's latest show, which involved unfolding tents and other structures. They had tracked the show from the last location before Felix made the decision to enter SWAT style. Half assembled, it didn't look all that impressive, though from careful observation, all the equipment seemed to be in good repair. Felix nodded. They barely escaped the comet that destroyed their planet. "I think a total of 4 transport ships made it off, which meant approximately 10,000 Dragorans needed new homes. I suppose they went in separate directions, but the Dracos ship was the only one to reach Earth. They basically had nothing, but then their wealth grew. They're required to file annual taxes with both the IRS and with us, and it's astounding how quickly they've gained a sizable fortune. The Drugorans and the Dracos family have been on my radar for a long time, Agent Sage. She nodded but didn't have time to make a reply, because an angry roar filled the air. She looked up, because that was where the sound had originated from, and her mouth dropped open as she saw a Dragoran materializing in the air above them, appearing completely visible by the time he touched ground. She'd forgotten they could camouflage themselves. Her mouth went dry, and she forgot all about why she was there for a moment. If Kex had been an interesting representative of his species, this one was surely the epitome. He was at least a half-foot taller than his brother and far broader, with thick muscles and an impressive wingspan. He hadn't folded away his wings neatly like Kex had. They sprouted behind him, giving him a royal plumage that was both intimidating and oddly attractive. She blinked at the thought, struggling to wrench her gaze away from his striking purple eyes and look anywhere but at his bare chest and flat stomach, which was proving so distracting. Felix moved forward as the new alien reached the van where agents had been loading Kex. Lauren followed behind, since Felix was her partner, along with being the sack. When they reached the alien, she was certain he was angry. It wasn't just his expression, or even the way he held his wings. It seemed to emanate off of him in waves. She had no latent empathic abilities of which she was aware, but she could suddenly pick up on his emotions, as though he had handed her a card with them written plainly on it. "What's going on here?" His voice was a delicious rumble that seemed to reverberate through her chest and spread outward. He had a low, rough note to it that was sexy. What was wrong with her? She shouldn't be thinking that way about any alien, but especially one who was embroiled in their investigation, even peripherally. "Your brother has been identified as a member of a group selling unauthorized alien technology to Earth criminals. He's under arrest and faces interrogation." Lauren frowned, realizing Felix had known Kex was this one's brother, but hadn't revealed it to any of the agents. She supposed it didn't matter, but it felt like a gap in information, and it was an oversight she wouldn't have expected from her mentor. With a growling sound, the alien who had captured her attention turned to Kex. "Have you done this crime?" "I haven't, Kerr. I wouldn't do that. I know I've had some scrapes with the department, and I've done some things of which you don't approve, but I promise you, I haven't been selling alien technology." He hung his head. "I know the Shebor who identified me, but I don't know why he claimed I was involved. He was a good kid despite some scuffles, and he worked as my assistant sometimes." Kerr, as his brother had identified him, turned back to face them. His gaze remained locked on Felix. "My brother had nothing to do with it." Felix arched a brow. "You'll understand why I can't just take his word for it. He's been identified as involved, and he's currently an alien of interest. He has to come with us." Kerr crossed his arms over his chest. "Fine, but I'm coming too." Lauren wasn't certain about his stance on the matter. It wasn't standard operating procedure to allow a family member to accompany another alien for interrogation, though of course they were entitled to a representative, but when no one made any effort to argue with Kerr Dracos' dictate, she realized not all the rules applied to this family. It was an unsettling epiphany, but she certainly wasn't going to challenge him either. As a relatively new agent, Lauren wasn't involved with the interrogation. Instead, she stood quietly outside the room observing through the two-way glass. She wasn't alone in the hallway though. Kerr was beside her, a silent but unnerving companion, as they observed the exchange between Felix and Kex. "You don't find it at all coincidental that the Grotesquerie has been in every city where we've tracked the influx of weapons? In fact, your show was in Philadelphia last night. I find it too neat to be coincidental." Kex looked worried. "I don't know anything about it, Agent Renton. I'm telling you the truth. I don't know why Schwach said my name, but I had nothing to do with it. You're facing banishment to Terria 7. Is that really what you want? If you identify the others involved, we might be able to work out an arrangement where you're chipped and subject to continuous monitoring, but won't be taken off-world. Do you really want to give up your fancy life you have here to protect a bunch of alien scum, with no regard for any life in the galaxies? Kerr rumbled softly beside her, and she turned her head to look at him. It was like a fist through the solar plexus when his gaze met hers, and she was instantly drawn into the deep depths of his purple eyes. She shook her head, trying to dispel the reaction. There's not enough proof to banish my brother. Lauren licked her lips, finding them suddenly dry. That's for the tribunal to decide. His shoulders stiffened. My brother's being set up by someone, and your system is running roughshod over him. I thought you agents were tasked with actually investigating, rather than simply accusing and acting with no regard for the truth. We are, and we're trying, but we're also desperate to stop the flood of alien technology into the market. If you have a better idea, I'd like to hear it, because it's obvious the Grotesquerie is somehow involved, even if Kex isn't. He let out that growling sound again. It isn't obvious to me, but if you're so convinced it's the Grotesquerie, then you should investigate the show, not just my brother. That's an excellent idea, said a soft voice behind them. Kerr and Lauren turned from each other to face the source. Lauren managed what she hoped was a professional smile, as she nodded her head respectfully. Director Simmons, I didn't realize you were directly involved with the investigation. The director, despite her diminutive size and standing no more than 5 feet, was imposing in her own right. There was something about the way she held herself, along with her sharp eyes, that spoke of her authority. It doesn't look much like an investigation to me at the moment, Agent Sage. She waved toward the glass, where Felix was leaning over Kex, who was sweating and looking close to breaking. That looks like browbeating to me. Go tell Agent Renton to stand down, Agent Sage. Lauren swallowed the lump in her throat, not looking forward to that task. Felix could be like a bulldog when he focused on a goal, and he wouldn't appreciate his junior agent and partner telling him to rein it in. At least, she had the authority of the director behind her. As she moved to the interrogation room, she was vaguely aware of the director moving closer to Kerr, and the two of them whispering in low tones. With a deep breath, she opened the door to the interrogation room and stepped inside. She cleared her throat. Agent Renton? He looked up at her from where he was perched over Kex, invading the alien's personal space. You aren't authorized to be in here, Lauren. I know, but... Get out. You're interrupting the interrogation. She cleared her throat, making her voice firm. Felix, the director has requested you to stand down and exit the room. He stiffened, and his anger was obvious when he slowly pulled away from looming over Kex to follow her. Since when did you become her messenger boy? He hissed the question as he walked past her, almost hitting her with the door. She glared at him. For the most part, she got along well with Felix, but he could be a real jerk when he was sidetracked or requested to do something he didn't think was the right course. Felix looked like he wanted to blast the director, but he drew to an abrupt halt when he realized she was still in conversation with Kerr. He muttered something under his breath, but she couldn't catch the words. The director looked up, waving them both forward. Let's talk in my office. As they started to walk away, Lauren hung back. Felix was her partner, but she wasn't anywhere near the level necessary to being invited to a meeting with the director. Come along, Agent Sage. This affects you too. At the director's words, and completely puzzled by them, she followed the group down the hallway and into the director's spacious office. It certainly didn't look like the typical bureaucratic space. There was a desk and chair, along with the usual office accoutrements, but there was also a comfortable sitting area in one corner, and a profusion of plant life. As she walked by, an orange plant caressed her cheek with a tendril, and she paused to look at it. She didn't know what it was, since she hadn't focused on alien botany as her specialty while training for a position as an agent, but it was clearly alien. "That's an Anjovian fern," said Kerr from behind her. His voice was as soft as she'd heard it since he had arrived in the middle of the chaos of arresting his brother. "It can detect pheromones from other life forms, and it responds to kindness and compassion. The plant thinks highly of you." She blushed, uncertain if she was receiving a compliment from him or the plant, or if it was simply an observation. Oh! It wasn't the most eloquent response she could have given, but she really didn't know how to respond. He moved past her, and she realized she was holding up the group. She moved away from the plant, and over to the last remaining seat. Felix and Director Simmons had both taken the armchairs, so the only spot left was on the sofa. There was almost a cushion between herself and Kerr, but she was still strangely aware of his presence, almost feeling his skin against hers despite the space between them. "What's this about, Director?" "I was close to a breakthrough." He was about to confess. The director nodded. "I believe you might be right, but the question is if he was confessing to a crime of which he was guilty, or if he simply felt it was the only way to escape that room. I know everyone is desperate to solve this mystery, Agent Renton, but bending the rules and cutting corners isn't the way to do it. I want a solid foundation and real proof before I turn over anyone to the tribunal to face banishment or exportation." "I suppose it has nothing to do with the fact that the Dracoses have way too much power and influence with the department?" Felix phrased the question bitterly, as he cast a scathing glance at Kerr before looking back at the director. Director Simmons's mouth pursed. "That's an unfair accusation. I conduct all investigations with a fair and balanced hand, and I require proof from everyone." That alien's name on the lips of a dying kid, caught up in something bigger than him, wasn't enough proof for you? The director took a deep breath. "I suggest reining in your tone, Agent Renton. You're good at getting results and you're a fine agent, but you're skirting perilously close to insubordination right now. Calm down and listen." Lorne was surprised when Felix slumped back against the chair, his mouth closed even though his expression was still angry. She'd never seen anyone handle Felix that way before, and her esteem of the director rose another notch, even though she was chewing out Lorne's partner. Of course, a dying confession carries a lot of weight, but he simply said Kex's name. There could be more at play than we're aware. You were the one who was privy to his dying declaration. Are you calling me a liar? Because Tom Wilkes was right there with me. She frowned, her annoyance clear. No, I'm not, Agent Renton. I'm simply saying he whispered a name to you, with no other information. For all you know, it could have been a dying request for a friend. We don't have enough evidence to act on his confession. You know, 80% of the time, the tribunal deports or banishes aliens brought before them, and it's always the right call, but it's also based on strong evidence submitted by the department. That's what we require in this case, before we can move forward. We've been digging at this for months, Director Simmons. What do you suggest? I think it's somehow tied to the grotesquerie. There's enough evidence to support that supposition, but it's also a tight-knit community of hundreds of aliens. They won't talk to us, but Lord Dracos has a suggestion, and I have endorsed it. What kind of suggestion? Asked Felix with obvious suspicion. He suggests the two of you go undercover as part of the show, which will allow you access to investigate the parts we can't officially. It might also earn you some trust among the people, and they might open up to you. Undercover. In the Grotesquerie? Felix shook his head, looking disgusted. How are we supposed to do that? Radical surgery to become mutants? Kerr stiffened. My people aren't mutants. They're simply aliens from various planets around the galaxies. We make a living the best way we can, and humans see what they want to see. When they view our shows, they think we're simply diseased or mutated humans with horrible disfigurements. They don't suspect we're aliens because they don't want to know. As it turns out though, you wouldn't be going into the show in any performance capacity, Agent Renton. Then what am I supposed to do there? It's not like you employ humans. You'll be acting as Agent Sage's father, and she'll be undercover as the Fire Lord's assistant. Lauren froze in shock, her gaze darting between the director and Kerr for a minute, before she shook her head. What? No one noticed you this morning, because you were on the fringes of the arrest, said the director. Most of the members of the show weren't up yet, or hadn't rendezvoused with the advance group that sets up the buildings and prepares for the shows while in town. You're an unknown face. According to your employment records, you've studied gymnastics for years, so you should be capable of the maneuvers required. Felix will be there to watch your back, though he'll be disguised. He'll have to alter his appearance somewhat, because some might remember him after this morning's spectacular arrests. Wouldn't it be safer to have a different agent acting as her father? Asked Kerr. Lauren felt like she was on the verge of hysteria. It was an overwhelming assignment for someone who was just gaining her feet in the field. Something about Kerr himself made her reluctant to take the job as well. It wasn't because he frightened her exactly. It was more that he intrigued her in a way strictly beyond professional. Working closely with him seemed like a recipe for disaster. Perhaps it would be safer, but I feel Felix is the best person for the job, Lord Dracos. He's been in charge of this investigation from the beginning, and he's one of our best agents. He's also Lauren's partner, and he'll look out for her. Kerr seemed satisfied and he nodded. Felix also nodded grudgingly, though he was clearly annoyed by the whole idea. Lauren herself was just terrified, both of failing at the assignment and at spending so much time working closely with the alien beside her. She swallowed the lump in her throat and said, "I'm ready for this, Director Simmons." She sounded far more confident than she felt when she gave the assurance. Chapter 2. Despite the task before her, and her uncertainty about being able to do it, it was a relief to finally arrive at the Grotesquerie the next afternoon. That feeling of relief came from being able to escape the confines of the car. Felix had driven them, and he'd also practically driven her insane with his complaints about going undercover, along with his suspicions directed toward everyone. She understood he'd been an agent for a long time and had seen a lot of things, both good and bad, but to call him jaded was an understatement. She wasn't thrilled about the assignment either, but it might be just the break they were looking for to finally solve the case and stop the flow of alien technology into the black market. When Felix parked the car alongside several other vehicles, Kerr was there a moment later to greet them. She offered him a tentative smile he didn't return, before turning away from him to grab her bag. To her surprise, he lifted it before she could take it from the trunk. Thanks." It was an awkward moment, and her reply reflected that. "I put you in a trailer near mine, since you're my new assistant." Kerr walked forward, not waiting to see if Felix kept up with them, though he did. As they traversed the grounds where the Grotesquerie would be for the next 3 nights, she looked around her to take it all in. Tonight was the first performance, though she doubted she would have to perform just yet. The site reflected the forthcoming hum of activity. All the tents and buildings had been erected, and the grounds bustled with activity as aliens moved about. It was like a miniature version of the Interstellar Alliance, or the mock UN she had participated in during high school. That Kerr had found a way to get so many diverse aliens living and working together was an impressive feat. They moved away from the main part of the show, where the visitors would pour in, to the margins. Here there were a collection of small trailers, and this was evidently the living space. They passed several before he stopped beside a small silver arrowhead, according to the name on the front of it. Kerr opened the door but didn't step inside. She could see why. He would have clearly had a difficult time folding his frame through the narrow entrance. "This is your trailer." He turned his attention to Felix. "I've arranged for you to bed down in one of the tents. It acts like a communal bunkhouse." Felix's mouth tightened. "I'm not letting Lauren out of my sight." She bit back a sigh of impatience. "I think that probably isn't practical, Felix. I appreciate the concern, but I'll be fine." She'd be fine no matter what, she decided. The trailer was tiny, and after spending the last 2 hours cooped up in the car with Felix, she'd had enough of him for at least the day. The idea of trying to share this tiny space with him wasn't at all appealing. Plastering on a smile after stowing her bag inside the trailer, she turned back to Kerr. "Where do you want me and when?" "Come to my trailer in half an hour. I'll get your father settled before then, and we can run through the routine." She nodded, and watched them walk away for a moment, before stepping on the metal stair, and holding tightly to the handle on the outside of the trailer. When she entered, it was a little larger than she'd expected judging from the outside dimensions, but it certainly strained the imagination to apply the word cozy. It was downright cramped. Still, it would do for a few days, which was all the time she hoped to be in residence. The bedroom was also the living room, the bed folding up or down into a couch depending on her needs. The kitchen also doubled as the dining room, and there was a small bathroom with a tiny toilet and a minuscule shower in the space separating the living room and kitchen. She glanced in briefly, surprised to see a list of instructions above the toilet. She'd never been anywhere before that required specific instructions on how to use the bathroom, but as she read through the steps, she was glad for the guidance. She had worn jeans and a t-shirt for the drive, so she hoped they would be suitable for practicing the routine. It had been too many years since she'd done gymnastics, and though she had been good, she was now rusty. She spent her last 10 minutes before finding Kerr doing a stretching routine and trying to warm up muscles that hadn't been used in that way for a long time. With 2 minutes to spare, she left her new trailer and went to Kerr's. It was easy to identify both by its size and the flame decals decorating the sides, along with the logo of Fire Lord emblazoned on the front. She knocked on the door, which was considerably wider than the one leading into her trailer. It made sense though, because with his broad shoulders, he would need a more accommodating space. He didn't invite her in. He just opened the door and stepped out, closing it behind himself before turning to her. "I've arranged to have the practice tent all to ourselves for a few hours each day, until we get down our routine." He led her through the rest of the trailers to a large tent. It seemed to be second nature to him when he lifted the flap and held it open for her so she could precede him. When she stepped inside, her eyes widened at the array of equipment before them. There were safety nets, a high balance beam, and a platform at least 15 feet tall with trapeze bars leading to another platform. It was a daunting sight. She licked her lips. "I did gymnastics when I was younger, but it's been a long time, and I never did anything like this." He shrugged. "We'll make it work. The first thing you need to do is get rid of those clothes." Her eyes widened in shock. "Excuse me? I have no intention of doing any show in the nude." He surprised her by grinning. As interesting a show as that would be, I'm certain it would violate the rules of most of the municipalities where we perform." As he spoke, he moved to the corner, where there appeared to be a small dressing area behind the screen. He popped open a trunk near it, rummaging for a moment before he lifted out what seemed to be a purple leotard at first glance. When he handed it to her, it didn't feel like lycra though. She looked up at him. "What is this?" "It's your suit. There's another one for performances that has more sequins and all the flash you'd expect." She stroked her hand over the super soft material. "What's it made from?" "Liberium. It's an element from my homeworld and is impervious to most ranges of temperature, either freezing or scorching. It will keep you safe and unharmed from the flames." She shuddered slightly. "What flames?" Rather than tell her, he must have simply decided to show her. One moment he appeared as he had since she met him. The next second, he ignited in a massive conflagration that burned around him in a radius of 2 feet. She was just outside the scorch zone, and she could feel the heat radiating from him. Her mouth dropped open in shock as the flames consumed him, but he appeared uninjured. As quickly as he had ignited himself, the flames disappeared, and there was no proof or evidence that he had just combusted. "That's amazing. How did you do that?" "I simply manipulated the molecules in the air to superheated capacity and manifested it as flames." "Was it real fire?" It had certainly felt real and looked real. No wonder the Fire Lord show was the most popular of the Grotesquerie, according to the brief research she'd had time to undertake. He nodded. "It is, but thanks to my unique physiology, it doesn't bother me." "Is it the same for all through Dragorans?" He nodded. "It's commonplace on my world, but it's unique here on Earth. Of course the crowd doesn't believe I'm actually setting myself on fire, or they're certain I have protective clothing, but it still seems to be something that draws in the masses." "I can see why." She didn't expound on that, having no desire to share how attractive he had become when he was lit up in flames. He was already a sexy devil, so he didn't need any help appealing to humans. Seeing him aflame had just been primitive and dangerous, but incredibly beautiful too. For the briefest moment she'd had the compulsion to reach out and touch him when he was engulfed by the fire, but she was certain it would have injured her badly. That thought brought her back to the suit she was holding, and she looked down at it doubtfully. "Are you sure this is flame retardant?" He nodded again. "I wouldn't risk your safety, Agent Lauren. I assure you you'll be just fine in the suit, and I'll ensure the flames don't touch anywhere that isn't covered by it." "You can control it that well?" "Of course I can. I'm Dragoran. We all have an instinctive control of our abilities." She had the briefest and most inappropriate thought, speculating about how controlled he would be in bed. Would he reach the point of losing control so much that he might burst into flame? Having sex with him would be a dangerous experience, so why did the idea of doing so send a thrill of want through her? She wasn't an adrenaline junkie, and she didn't live for danger. Kerr shouldn't be nearly as attractive to her as he was. She certainly couldn't act on it, and did her best to suppress any awareness. She needed to keep her focus on the investigation, and she wouldn't risk compromising it, or even being accused of compromising it, by becoming involved with the brother of the main suspect. She'd just have to ensure her newfound pyrophilic tendencies returned to a dormant state. She refused to be attracted to the alien in front of her. He gestured with his thumb toward the changing area. "Get changed and join me in a few minutes, and we'll go through the routine. I've designed a new one to incorporate an assistant, since I generally work alone." Despite her internal vow to suppress the attraction, she could see why he would appeal to the crowds working alone. He was mesmerizing enough that he probably didn't need an assistant to divert their attention. She slipped out of her clothes and put on the suit. It fit her like a second skin, and she was self-conscious of the roundness of her butt and the slight thickness to her thighs. She certainly didn't have a perfect body, and the suit revealed that fact for anyone to see. With a shrug, she decided it didn't matter. The crowds would be staring at the fire created by Kerr, not looking at her. She was more of an afterthought, and even if anyone noticed she could lose a few pounds, it was a minuscule issue in the scheme of things. With a deep breath, she emerged from behind the screen to find Kerr waiting for her. His gaze flicked over her from head to toe, but his expression revealed nothing. She struggled to keep her expression similarly neutral. It was difficult because while she had been changing clothes, he'd been removing his. He wore a pair of skin-tight shorts and nothing else. It was a struggle to keep her eyes locked with his, and not allow her gaze to stray lower. A purple emblem on his chest caught her attention, but she looked away rather than focusing on it, to allay her curiosity. If he had been impressive before, he was downright awe-inspiring now. It didn't seem fair that such perfection existed, and she couldn't take a moment to absorb all the details. As soon as they began the routine, she was able to forget about his distracting state of undress, well, mostly, as she focused on learning her part. As she had expected, she was more of a backdrop than anything. He did a succession of tricks, all involving fire, and each more progressively impressive than the last. He had incorporated her into his performance fairly seamlessly, and it wasn't going to be as physically demanding as she had feared. Mostly, she was there to highlight the fact that humans weren't impervious to flame. As they neared the end of the routine, he lifted her into his arms. She let out a startled yelp at the contact, but it certainly wasn't from pain. She liked his hands on her too much. "I'm sorry if I hurt you." He gave the words gruffly. "It's fine." She certainly wasn't going to tell him the truth. He spun her around. "When I toss you in the air, hug your knees and try to do a backflip." "Throw me." "I don't know about this, Kerr." "I promise, I won't let anything happen to you, Lauren. This is part of the routine. I need you to figure out how to do it, and keep yourself aloft long enough for me to lift this chair. You're going to land in it and sit, just as you would if you were about to have a meal." She eyed the chair beside him doubtfully, before looking up. "I'm still not sure about this." "Are you willing to at least try?" His voice held a bite of impatience. Biting her lip, she reluctantly nodded. It seemed to be all he was waiting for, because he abruptly tossed her in the air. He had even more strength than she realized, because she went soaring. She tried to remember to tuck her body as he had instructed, but she felt hopelessly graceless as she tumbled through the air and back down into his arms. What happened to the chair? It was an unexpected landing, to be back in his arms. "We won't introduce that element until you've gotten some aerial control. I don't want you injured." That was what they worked on for the next hour. He seemed to never tire, though her muscles were growing stiff and sore, and her neck felt like she had whiplash from the number of times she collided with him in a jarring jolt. She couldn't seem to get the spin right. "We're going to stop for today. We'll do 2 practices tomorrow, but I want you to have a chance to rest for now. Tomorrow, I'll bring in harnesses and cords and we can practice your flips." He tilted his head to the side. "We might do away with the chair. I think maybe instead of you landing on that, I'll just catch you in my arms, fold you in my wings and light myself on fire. That will protect you, and it should be enough of a finale to satisfy the audience." She nodded, liking the idea. Her muscles were too shaky for her to manage much more than a simple nod. She already had the landing part down, and she'd much rather land in the security of his arms than try to aim for and hit the wooden chair. She also wasn't thrilled at the idea of him lighting the chair on fire once she was seated on it, though he'd already told her it was treated with the same element composing her suit. Moving away from him on shaky legs, she returned to her trailer. She hadn't expected the routine to take so much out of her physically, and she barely managed to fold the couch into a bed before she collapsed on the futon and allowed herself the luxury of a nap. Chapter 3. Kerr returned to his trailer, his mind chaotic. He was accustomed to being in a calm and thoughtful state, so this change was unwelcome. So what was the cause of it? Why was he reacting so strongly to a human, and not just any human, but an agent for the Alien Immigration and Integration Department, the same organization that currently held his brother without filing formal charges, clearly having decided he was guilty of a crime based on someone else's word? An agent should be the last human in the world he'd want anything to do with, and he certainly shouldn't be reacting on a physical level. Perhaps he should visit Tulunta. It had been several months since the last time he'd shared her bed, and he abruptly remembered why. She was starting to become too emotional, changing their arrangement from simple pleasure to something more, despite his warning not to do such a thing when they had first become casually involved. To be honest, Tulunta didn't appeal to him anyway, at least not in his current state. There was only one female he wanted, and guilt swept through him at the thought. This guilt was inspired by the feeling of betraying his mate that swept over him, not because the department held his brother. Philandria had been dead for 12 Earth years, and while he didn't feel the same sharp sting of grief that he felt in the beginning, thinking about her still made him sad. It also made him reluctant to pursue anything with another woman, because he and Philandria had bonded for life. It was the way of their culture, and he didn't like finding Lauren attractive or intriguing. It had been easy with Tulunta and a few other females before her, who were selected merely as bedmates, but there was something different about the agent. He didn't know what it was exactly, but his instincts warned him to be on the alert, because she could get through the carefully bolstered walls guarding his heart if he wasn't careful. He paced the confines of his trailer for a while longer, mulling over the subject with himself. He would have liked to get Kex's view, but his brother was still a political prisoner. That wasn't the technical definition, but it certainly felt like it. Not that he truly needed Kex's advice. He knew what his brother would tell him, because he'd given the words before. Kex believed it was time for him to move on and consider taking a new mate. Then again, Kex had never bonded with anyone before their planet was destroyed, and he hadn't known the agony of being light years away from his wife when they'd heard the news that their planet was demolished. Without having known that kind of loss and suffering, and the strong bond between himself and Philandria, how could Kex really understand why he was so reluctant to move on? Still, he would have appreciated counsel besides his own, and he was equally certain Kex would have advised avoiding any entanglements with the department's agents. That was the wise thing to do, and he would simply have to remember that if his libido got the best of him. Surely that was all it was, a chemical reaction exacerbated by a recent lack of release since he had distanced himself from Tulunta. He was worrying for nothing. Lauren was stiff and sore the next morning, as she'd expected, but Kerr didn't take it easy on her. He seemed determined to drive her harder than he had yesterday, and she gritted her teeth as she somehow endured the punishment. It certainly felt like punishment, though she didn't think she had done anything personally. No doubt he harbored a grudge against all the department's people, since they were holding Kex without a trial or further proof. She couldn't blame him for the reaction, but she couldn't change it either. She was a lowly agent, and she certainly had no input on rules and regulations or the revision of such. Perhaps he simply wanted her performance to be flawless. That made far more sense, since they were working with a narrow time frame. Their first performance was tomorrow night, and he needed her to have at least a semblance of competency so the audience wouldn't feel cheated, and the others in the Grotesquerie wouldn't question her presence. She was gasping for air when he called a halt shortly after 1 o'clock. She gratefully took the bottle of water he extended, along with grabbing the white towel she'd brought with her. She wiped herself off, removing all the sweat as best she could. She hadn't worked out like this in a long time. There had been equally grueling days when she had done gymnastics, particularly in her early teens, when she had toyed with the idea of going pro before her body blossomed, inhibiting some of her flexibility. Her trainer had not so gently told her she wasn't suited for the profession, but that hadn't stopped him from working her to the point of exhaustion for months beforehand. She thought she had left those days behind, so it was an unpleasant experience to endure them again. "We'll break for lunch, and then we'll come back and do it again." She barely reined in the impulse to say something along the lines of "yippee," in a sarcastic tone. Lauren simply nodded as she followed him from the tent. Once they emerged from the practice area, she stood awkwardly for a moment. "Where do I get food?" Last night and this morning, she'd eaten what had been in her trailer, including 3 protein bars and a package of jerky. All the snacks were gone now, and she was ravenous. With a grunt, he furled his wings closer to his body and gestured her to follow behind him. Apparently, the Dragarin wasn't big on conversation. She hadn't met any others besides himself and Kex, so she had no idea if that was typical. The Alien Immigration and Integration Department databanks revealed only scant details about the cultural characteristics and personalities of the typical Dragarin. She had committed it all to memory, but what was there had taken less than an hour to memorize. He led her into a smaller tent that clearly acted as a cafeteria. She got in line behind him, grabbing a tray as she moved down the line. It was simple fare but all recognizable, and her stomach growled with appreciation. Grasping her tray, she looked around for a seat. She assumed Kerr would want to sit separately from her, so she was somewhat startled when he gently nudged her arm and nodded toward a table with several seats available. She was even more surprised when he seemed to be following her to them, taking a spot beside her, though there was space between them. The surprises kept coming as Felix stepped into the tent, catching sight of them. He didn't bother with a tray, as he came over to sit across the table from them. He looked weary. She took time for a few bites of the chili before asking, "Have you had any luck?" Felix snorted. "Of course not. I'm an outsider, and a human at that. No one says a thing." "That's no surprise," said Kerr. "We're a close-knit community, and everyone in the Grotesquerie has an anomaly that makes them different from humans. As you can imagine, we face quite a bit of prejudice and thoughtlessness from humans who mock our appearance. You'll find few in the show who trust humans. And that's without your connection to." He trailed off, clearly unwilling to speak the department's name in case someone was listening to their conversation. "What are you officially doing for the show?" She took a drink of milk after asking the question. "I'm part of the setup crew. Which means after everything's set up, I just sit on my ass." Felix clearly chafed at the idea. She experienced a surge of sympathy for her fellow agent. "I know it's frustrating, but we need to give this a little time. It's our best chance of finding," she broke off abruptly, as a smaller Dragarin suddenly appeared at the head of the table, eyeing them with cold interest. "Finding what?" asked the Dragarin female when the silence lengthened. "A home," said Lauren, slipping back into her persona. "Dad and I have been looking for that for a long time." The female sniffed and her wings fluttered. "I hope you don't think 2 humans are going to find a home at the Grotesquerie." She turned her purple eyes on Kerr. Really, darling, what were you thinking with this? Kerr's shoulders stiffened, and he glared at the woman standing over him. I was thinking that I own the Grotesquerie, and I'll hire whomever I choose. It isn't your business to lunta. She appeared unbothered by his tone. She simply looked at Lauren and then Felix once more before shaking her head. Don't get too comfortable here, humans. We might be forced to work with you, but this will never be your home. Before Kerr had a chance to admonish her if he had chosen to, she had turned and strode away. Her wings fluttered behind her as she did so, and she was definitely a striking being. Along with being a real witch. Lauren kept that thought to herself, though she was certain Felix shared it. It was a bit disconcerting to be discriminated against simply because she was human, but she imagined the people who lived and worked in the show experienced the sort of thing on a daily basis. Sensitivity training was a mandatory course for agents, and it assisted in navigating the delicate balance of power between humans and aliens. But with aliens remaining mostly unknown to the majority of humans, there was no formal legislation to prevent discrimination against them. Lauren wasn't naive enough to believe that all agents avoided discrimination either. She could use Felix as an example, but he wasn't discriminating against aliens by assuming they were all bad. He assumed the same of most humans too. Shaking her head, she tried to forget about the encounter as she finished her lunch. All too soon, Kerr announced it was time to return to practice. With a small moan as her muscles were forced to work again, she got to her feet and bussed her tray before following him from the tent. He took her back to the site of torture and put her through the grinder for the rest of the afternoon. When she was finally done, she repeated her day much she had yesterday, by going immediately to her trailer and collapsing on the futon as soon as she had pulled it out into a bed. She was asleep before her head hit the pillow. Chapter 4. Lauren wasn't exactly ready for the performance the next night, but she was better prepared than she had been when they had first started training for the routine. She wasn't going to be a spectacular standout, but that wasn't her purpose. She was simply an accessory for Kerr, a counterpoint to his strangeness, and a familiar face to the humans in the crowd. She also underscored Kerr's supposed mutations with her complete normality. She wriggled into the performance leotard, nonplussed to discover it revealed more of her flesh than the practice one. The mesh panel exposed her midriff and the lowest part of her cleavage on the underside of her breasts. It covered her from neck to ankle and down to her wrists, but those clever mesh panels appeared randomly to reveal the flesh underneath. Her entire back was bared as well by the translucent mesh. She grimaced at the sight in the mirror, but looked away quickly. This was part of the assignment, and it didn't matter if she wouldn't have voluntarily worn such a garment otherwise. She was acting in a role to solve an important mystery and hopefully exonerate Kex. She jerked her gaze back to the mirror at that point, wondering when her focus had become about exonerating Kerr's brother. That didn't mean she was prepared to tamper with evidence, but she truly didn't think the younger Dragoran had anything to do with the flood of alien technology on the black market. As she pinned up her black hair and applied makeup to emphasize the blue of her eyes, she was sure she was neutral and unbiased despite an unwelcome attraction for Kerr. She waited backstage in the main performance tent after getting ready, receiving her first glimpse of the show. She had seen other aliens in passing, but most of her time had been spent in the tent with Kerr or sleeping in her trailer. She was amused and amazed by how well the aliens had adapted the expected shows from circus and sideshow performers, somehow making it compatible with each of their physiology. There was a tiny Dizo, not much more than 3 feet tall, swallowing the sword that had to be at least a foot longer than she was. Lauren assumed it was some sort of sword that retracted somewhat, but it could be the Dizos' physiology had no problem with a real sword either. If she remembered correctly, they had a jelly-like cushioning around their major organs. 2 Tarians came next, and they were so identical she assumed they were sisters. With their light pink skin and darker pink hair pinned up in elaborate coif, they were stunning. Their routine consisted of acrobatics, followed by a floor show displaying their amazing flexibility. The men in particular in the audience were entranced, though everyone seemed to be mesmerized. Lauren was certain the Tarians didn't have any particular power of mesmerism or psychic persuasion, so it was because the performance was just that engrossing. She laughed in delight at the clown routine, which involved 2 Tardos and a dozen Dizos. The marked contrast in their heights was enough to titillate the audience, but the routine was funny and charming, which ensured a thunderous round of applause when it finished. Talunta came next, and a chill went through Lauren as she performed a knife show. The woman threw blades with deadly accuracy, making the volunteer she recruited from the audience tremble more than once, but seeming to have complete control. Even when the last knife rested less than an inch above his head, she seemed to have planned to put it there exactly on target. She was clearly competent, if not downright lethal, with her chosen skill. After the audience member stepped down from the platform and made his way back on shaky knees, she realized it was her turn when Kerr appeared beside her. This was the main part of the attraction, and after the primary performance concluded, people who had paid to attend could visit the various tents housing the oddities, which were simply aliens lounging in different poses or behind glass. They were the aliens who didn't have a talent, or preferred not to perform. When Kerr took her hand in his, she swallowed the lump of fear in her throat, suddenly remembering the stage fright she had gotten before every gymnastics competition. She had always managed to push through and do her best, so she expected nothing less of herself this time. Plastering on a fake smile, she walked with him onto the stage, making a point not to meet the gaze of anyone in the audience. There was a brief, almost stunned silence when they stood there, but when Kerr unfolded his wings, they gasped in delight. Talunta had wings too, of course, but she hadn't bothered to unfold them for the performance. From the audience, they could have been mistaken as sheets of flesh which hung from her back. There was no making that mistake with Kerr, though. Her heart rate ramped up when he unfurled his wings to their full wingspan. He was magnificent like that, and she was certain she wasn't the only human woman in the audience to think that. Her gaze fell to the purple tattoo across his chest, and it appeared to be some sort of symbol. She had barely noticed it before during their practice sessions, but tonight it glowed. Had he applied some sort of cosmetic to make it far more obvious? Whatever it was, or why, was now suddenly visible, which might have been something as simple as she hadn't noticed because she'd been so engrossed in learning the routine. It was straight up sexy. That realization surprised her, because she'd never gone for the bad boy tatted up type. Not that he was tattooed everywhere. It appeared to be his only marking, and she wasn't even certain if he was a bad boy. He owned and ran the Grotesquerie, providing employment and stability in as much of a structured environment as a traveling show could provide for hundreds of aliens. That didn't sound like a bad boy to her. No wonder she was drawn to him. He was practically the clean-cut Boy Scout type, except for the wings, the ability to manipulate molecules to create fire, imperviousness to such fire, and the impressive wingspan. Yeah, he could pass for a Boy Scout. She snorted at herself, thankful the crowd drowned out the sound. Kerr turned to her, and the routine was soon underway. She focused so hard on remembering her part that she forgot about the audience, except for the occasional reminder from them filtered through her consciousness. Their claps and oohs and ahs occasionally overwhelmed the thumping of her heart, as she put herself through the paces and focused on what was expected of her. While she was performing, she wasn't completely Agent Sage. She was also Lauren, the stage assistant. She was so focused on what she was doing that she didn't realize she was in danger until it was almost too late. Kerr had just thrown her into the air, and she was concentrating on spinning while tucking her body into a perfect ball to increase her aerodynamics when a light came crashing down. She had nowhere to go, and it glanced off her shoulder as she twisted violently to avoid colliding with the object and crushing her skull. It fell to the stage with a shattering sound as she went off course. Lauren braced herself for a hard landing that never came. A moment later, she was swept into Kerr's arms as he flew into the air to catch her. The audience was shouting now, on their feet in their excitement. Kerr finished out the performance by landing gracefully, wrapping her in his arms, enfolding her with his wings, and lighting himself afire. It was warm held against him but not so hot that she feared burning. His wings sheltered her completely, though it required being pressed much too close to his skin for comfort. There was nothing comforting or relaxing about his embrace. It made her think of carnal thoughts instead, which only ramped up her heart rate that was already galloping after the near brush with death, or at least serious injury. He held her like that for about a minute, and she was aware when the fire whooshed away, because the temperature dropped a couple of degrees again. A moment after that, he stepped back and unfurled his wings. She plastered on a shaky smile and turned to the audience, holding out her arms and bouncing in a jaunty motion to indicate she was fine. That was part of the routine, but it was harder than it had been to complete the maneuver, because she wasn't fine. Her shoulder hurt like crazy, and she was still feeling the adrenaline rush, but not necessarily in a good way. Nausea surged in her stomach, but she still managed to give what she hoped was a convincing performance. Based on the standing ovation, she assumed it was. The rest of the performers in the show joined them on stage, and they all took a bow for the audience before the curtain closed. As soon as it did, Kerr pulled her away from the others and off to a quiet corner of the tent. He was frowning fiercely. "Let me see your shoulder." She shot a glance over her shoulder at the aliens standing behind them, some watching with curious eyes. Most had already moved on, clearly unaware of her accident, or perhaps just uncaring. Only Talunta remained for a moment, and her eyes gleamed with pleasure, making Lauren question whether it was an accident at all. "Do you think Talunta did it?" He shook his head. "I doubt it. If she wanted you dead, she would have been more direct about it. Sneaking around isn't really her style." Lauren licked her lips, her mouth dry. "Do you think it was an accident?" "No." His abrupt response sent a chill through her. "Was I the target or were you?" He arched a purple brow. "I'm certain it was you. Perhaps someone has figured out you and Felix aren't quite what we're presenting. Or perhaps they just don't want a human involved in the show. Whatever their motives, I'm sure you were the target. That means we need to keep a close eye on you." She shivered again, but this time it was from pleasure she didn't want to admit to, at the sound of him saying "we" in such a context. It suggested they were a team, and in it together. Though that was the illusion they were presenting, it was exactly that, an illusion. But for just a moment it felt real. Felix was waiting for her outside the tent as she left the performing area, intent on returning to her trailer. He was clearly worried and also angry. "I heard someone tried to kill you. You weren't there for the performance?" He shook his head, looking disgusted. "That sadistic alien asshole has me cleaning the grounds. He must really enjoy the power he's wielding over agents. He won't enjoy it for long. I'm going to ensure he and his brother are both locked up for as long as I can, before they're shipped off to Terria 7. Her head spun for a moment, and she frowned at her fellow agent. "I'm confused. Why would you put away Kerr, and we have no real proof Kex was involved?" He glared at her. "I think it's obvious from this display that Kerr is very much involved. Lauren shook her head. You're going to have to explain that leap in logic to me, because I can't follow it tonight. Her shoulder was throbbing, sending pain all the way up into her jaw at this point, and she just wanted an ice pack, the maximum dosage of ibuprofen, and an early night. Isn't it obvious he's the one who tried to kill you? She shook her head. You weren't there, Felix. He's the one who saved me from running into some kind of object in my mad landing. He flew to catch me, which is something I don't think is normally part of the show. It's one thing to appear to be genetically mutated, but humans aren't too likely to enjoy the prospect of what they believe is another human having a superior ability to them. He normally camouflages when flying. Felix gave her a pitying look. Don't drink the Kool-Aid, Agent Sage. Of course he tried to kill you. And of course he saved you because he wants you on his side. If he gives the appearance of having nothing to do with it, you're going to overlook anything that tells you otherwise. She frowned at Felix. So you believe Kerr tried to kill me so he could save me, just so I would perform a half-assed investigation and not look into his supposed guilt? Felix nodded solemnly. That's exactly what I'm suggesting. I think the weapons distribution goes much higher than Keck's. It goes to the top, and I think Kerr is funding his wealth and lifestyle through reselling alien technology, not through the Grotesquerie. How could you possibly make that kind of money with this place? She waved a hand around, pointing at the crowded grounds. Because people come out in droves to see anyone who is different. I have no trouble believing this business turns a huge profit, because I understand humanity. They like oddities and curiosities. This place is like a giant train wreck from which they can't look away. I don't view it that way, but I'm sure many people do. Felix set out a harsh sigh. I'm simply telling you to keep your eyes open, and don't be convinced of anyone's guilt or innocence, based on a few isolated incidences. And I guess I should say the same to you, Felix. Don't be convinced someone's guilty just because they're different from you. I really don't think Kerr or Kex had anything to do with the technology, though I'm sure it's involved in this show somehow. And I know we'll find the answer. We just have to keep an open mind and open eyes. He shook his head, clearly disagreeing with her, but no longer arguing. Why don't you go take care of yourself? You have another show tomorrow night, and I'd like to make sure you survive it. She took his words as a gruff offer of comfort, hoping he meant them that way. Felix was cynical, but she also knew he cared about her as a partner. He'd looked out for her from the first day she'd been assigned to him for training, and despite his rampant cynicism, she was certain he would look for the truth. This rehearsal was different, though it took Lauren a while to realize exactly why. Kerr was more distant than usual, and he was making small mistakes. When he started to toss her in the air, she put her hand on his shoulder. Hold on a minute. You're clearly distracted or something, so I'm not sure I want you throwing me around unless you're paying attention. Instead of lifting her, he let out a small sigh and set her on her feet. I apologize. She waited for him to expound on his apology, but the silence lengthened until she grew impatient. What do you apologize for? I'm not sure what's going on, but you're obviously not paying attention to rehearsal today. His lips tightened and he seemed reluctant to speak, though he eventually did so. I'm still rattled about last night. She frowned at him in confusion. I'm the one who was injured, and most likely the target. There's nothing to be concerned about. At least right now, in the moment. She was concerned about being the target of someone's attempt to kill her, but she wasn't certain they would try again so soon, especially during rehearsal with just herself and Kerr. It seemed like they had wanted witnesses, or perhaps that had simply been the easiest way to get to her. He scowled at her. That's why it rattled me. Lauren tilted her head to the side. What do you mean? I don't like how close you came to dying. Neither do I, she said, attempting levity. His expression remained serious. I intend to be on my guard more than ever. You're under my protection. It shouldn't have happened. She shrugged. I don't see how you could have stopped it. That's what bothers me about the situation. I couldn't stop it last night, and what's to keep it from happening again? The idea of you being injured. He trailed off. She waited for him to finish the thought, probing gently by saying, yes? He ran a hand through his purple-black hair. It bothers me more than it should. You should be just an agent, and while I wouldn't want anyone to be harmed, especially by someone in the Grotesquerie, I shouldn't care quite as much as I do at the thought of losing you. Her heart skipped a beat and she licked her lips, noticing suddenly how dry her mouth was. Oh. Why do you think that is? His gaze was scathing. I'm sure you can figure that out for yourself, Agent Sage. It was a clear breach of protocol and a conflict of interest to have an attraction to the alien whose brother she was investigating. It broke all sorts of rules to feel a flutter of excitement when she was near him, and it was totally crossing the line to move closer. Somehow, she couldn't still the compulsion, and the feminine side of her was drowning out the sensible voice of the agent in the back of her mind when she put her hands on his shoulders and stretched upward, allowing instinct to guide her as she sought out his mouth. He was too tall for her to reach him alone, and she held her breath as she waited to see if he would lower his head to meet her halfway. Even offering the kiss left her vulnerable and risked compromising the investigation, but she couldn't seem to stop herself. She held her breath as she waited to see if he would lower his head, or if he would push her away. As seconds ticked past, she was certain he wasn't going to kiss her. A wave of disappointment swept through her, followed by a scorching surge of embarrassment. Her cheeks flushed, and she started to step away from him. It was then that he moved forward, wrapping his arms around her to mold her body against his. His mouth slanted over hers, his tongue pressing insistently at the seam of her lips. There was no hesitation, and there was nothing tentative about the embrace. Of course she'd been kissed before, but never like this. It had never felt this way before. The myriad sensations sweeping through her were completely different from anything she'd ever experienced. He kissed just like a human man, but the kiss itself was completely dissimilar in how it made her feel. Kerr grasped a handful of her dark hair, gently pulling back her head so he could kiss her more deeply. She strained against him, clinging tightly to his shoulders as his kiss robbed her knees of the ability to stand upright. She slumped against him, relying on the alien for total support as she surrendered to the intensity of the kiss. It couldn't have possibly been hours that they kissed, but it felt like it when they finally broke apart. Her body was shaky, and her lips were bruised and tender, swollen from the passionate kisses they had exchanged. It was a pleasant sort of discomfort, the kind that made her want to keep going. Even as she watched, his expression shuddered. It was like a switch flipped to shut off the tender side of him. He was once again the foreboding alien he had been the first day they had met. The kiss had been amazing, but had also set them back. He seemed to be deliberately closing himself off, and there was obvious distance between them as he brusquely resumed practice. Technically, the performance was flawless this time, but it was also missing something. She couldn't identify exactly what, but it had something to do with a connection between herself and Kerr. A connection he was deliberately doing his best to sever. It shouldn't bother her. She should be trying to do the same, because she was here to do a job, and it wasn't to become the best assistant ever, and it certainly wasn't becoming his lover. That sort of distraction could stymie the investigation, and keep her from seeing all the details she needed to solve the case. She should be grateful that he had called a halt to it, and was clearly doing his best to ensure they remained emotionally separated, even though they were physically joined by the performance. She should feel grateful, but that wasn't at all what she was feeling. Regret just about summed it up. She regretted the circumstances of their meeting, regretted that her attraction obscured the investigation in any way, and most of all, she regretted the emptiness filling her as the separation continued throughout the afternoon. Not being able to have Kerr certainly didn't mitigate her desire to do so. The last performance in their current location was as flawless as the rehearsals had been, but she was certain the audience also felt the absence of whatever spark had existed between them before the incident. There was no standing ovation tonight, and no thunderous rounds of applause. Of course, everything went seamlessly, so there was no need for Kerr to fly either. Maybe that had accounted for the crowd's enthusiasm during the last performance, and maybe she was just projecting her own sense of being bereft onto the audience. Afterward, she slipped away to her trailer for an early night. Felix had drawn her aside at lunch, indicating he wanted to explore early in the morning. The maintenance crew would be tearing down the buildings and tents in preparation for moving to the next site, and he was certain the chaos would provide the perfect cover to poke around. So far, he'd had little luck discovering anything, because the residents of the Grotesquerie shut him out deliberately. She'd experienced the same to a lesser degree, but she hadn't had much time to investigate with having to learn the routine required to maintain her cover. Now that she had it down fairly well, she intended to return to the more important duties of an agent, especially with the magnitude of their assignment. She slept better than she'd expected, which was likely due to physical exhaustion. She hadn't yet grown accustomed to the additional workouts she had undertaken. She fell asleep almost as soon as she laid down, not waking until she heard the quiet tapping on her trailer the next morning. With a groan, she lifted her head from the pillow and glanced at the alarm clock. It was only a little past 8, but she could already hear the sound of the show being disassembled in preparation for moving to the next site. The tap came again, this time more insistently, and she forced herself to roll out of bed. "Coming," she called. When she opened the door a moment later, she was unsurprised to see Felix waiting for her. "I just woke up. Give me 5 minutes." He nodded, moving away from the trailer instead of inside, though he would have been welcome to come in. She turned toward the bathroom, making herself as presentable as possible in the 5 minutes she had. After joining Felix, they walked across the grounds. She didn't think Felix had a firm idea of what he was looking for either, so at the moment, they were simply observing. They paused near the center of the show, moving out of the flow of traffic to speak quietly. A bustle of activity coming from a yellow and orange tent caught her attention. "What's that?" He looked casually over his shoulder before back at her. "That's where they keep all the miscellaneous items, supposedly things necessary for each show." She arched a brow. "It seems pretty chaotic." He nodded. "If you wanted to hide something somewhere that was illegal but wanted to keep it accessible, without being linked directly to yourself, that might be a good place to hide it." He seemed disgruntled for a moment before he nodded. She resisted the urge to roll her eyes, certain he was put out because she'd noticed it before him. She pressed home her point. "It makes sense that if the alien or aliens involved with trafficking the weapons are part of the Grotesquerie, that they wouldn't want to keep proof in their own trailers or tents. They'd also need to have their stock on hand." He nodded. "I'll slip in casually and see what I can." Green, get your ass in gear. You're not being paid to socialize with the other human. They both stiffened at the gruff voice, and she looked away from Felix to eye the source. A large Tarto stood near them, hands on his hips as he glared down at Felix. For their assignment, he was undercover as Felton Green, so it was obvious the harsh words were directed toward him. She frowned, searching for a way to get him out of whatever job the Tartos had for him. Felix just sighed and shrugged. He turned his head so the alien couldn't read his lips. "I'll search the tent tonight," he mouthed at her. Then he spoke in his normal voice. "I'll see you later, honey." "Bye, Dad." She waved him off and turned away, setting a leisurely pace as though she was just out for her morning stroll. It irked her that Felix assumed only he could search the tent. She might be a junior agent, but she was still an agent. She'd been trained in investigation and evidence preservation, like every other graduate. When she neared the tent, which hadn't yet been stripped down for transport, she ducked around the back and shimmied under the flap. Lauren stayed low, crouched down for a moment as she examined the interior of the tent. There was no one else in there, but it was an overwhelming sight. Things were stacked haphazardly, covering most of the space. There was a path to walk through, but not much else. Without any sense of organization, she wasn't certain how to proceed in the most efficient manner possible with her limited time. She visually assessed the area around her, looking for things that stood out. There were trunks of costumes and various accessories, and she saved those for examining last. Anything that was stacked on top also seemed to be used frequently, so it wouldn't be as likely to hide something valuable and illegal. On the other hand, they clearly loaded this up and rearranged it every time they tore down the show and put it up somewhere else. If Felix's theory was correct, whoever was in charge of such a task might be the culprit they were looking for, and the one who was selling the technology. A stack of crates caught her attention, and she moved toward them carefully, so she didn't bump into anything else and send stacks falling. The resulting noise would alert anyone she was in here, and she had no plausible reason to be. When she reached the stacks, she realized she'd need a crowbar too. Unfortunately, no one had thoughtfully left one lying around, so she had to explore a bit. Halfway across the tent from the crates, she found a large toolbox on wheels. The drawers rattled when she opened them, moving as quietly she could, but she held her breath each time she had to dig through, waiting to see if someone would appear. In the fourth drawer down, she found the crowbar and took it before moving back to the crates. She slid the end underneath, in the gap between the lid and the box, and heaved with all her strength. It opened with a cracking sound, and she winced at the sight of the damage. Someone would know she'd opened it, though they wouldn't know it was her specifically. She waited a moment, ensuring no one came running at the sound before she started exploring. That crate was a dead end, full of popcorn and other supplies for the concession stands. The next two crates were equally mundane, but the one on the bottom, which required shifting the other three out of the way to access, sent a tingle of apprehension through her as soon as she cracked the lid. By the time she had it completely off, she was staring into a box of devices whose purpose wasn't easy to discern. She wasn't about to pick them up and see what the little balls did, but they looked sleek and dangerous. It was clearly some sort of alien technology, and she couldn't imagine what its purpose would be in the show. "Hey, what are you doing in here?" She stiffened before looking up from the crate. Lauren swallowed the lump in her throat as she continued looking up, until she met the gaze of the Korax in front of her. His gray skin looked tough as armor, and the black horns sprouting from either side of his head were wickedly sharp. She swallowed again, clearing her throat to buy time for an explanation. "I was looking for something." He glared at her. "Whatever it was, you don't need to be in Lord Kerr's private containers, human." A dart of dread shot through her when the alien identified the crate as belonging to Kerr. "I'm not sure where to look. He just said it was in the storage tent." "What's it?" he asked as he crossed his arms over his massive chest. She made a vague shape with her hands, spinning the details on the fly. "It's about this big and kind of glows or something." It's round. I thought it was one of these things. She reached in to pick up one of the balls in the crate, and his eyes widened. Don't touch that, you silly fool. Back away slowly. She frowned at him but snatched her hand back. What are they, mister? Blorick, he said, ignoring her first question. I suggest you return to Lord Kerr and ask for a better description of what he's wanting. Don't come poking around here again until you know what you're after, human. As an agent, she shouldn't have been intimidated by his tone or his posture, but she couldn't pretend she wasn't. The alien was a scary sight, and he was clearly threatening her, though perhaps not overtly. She was anxious to identify what the balls were, but she knew she wouldn't get the answer from Blorick. Instead, she'd have to seek out Kerr. She hastened from the tent, moving directly toward Kerr's trailer. She knocked firmly on the door, holding her breath as she waited for him to open it. It wasn't until he'd opened the door and stepped aside, inviting her in, that she realized what she was holding her breath in anticipation of, seeing him with a female companion. It was the last thing she should be thinking of at the moment, but she still couldn't resist the urge to dart her gaze around, looking for proof that someone had spent the night with him. There was no obvious sign of another's presence, though she supposed there could be someone hiding in his bedroom. It was certainly early enough that they weren't likely to be awake. In fact, Kerr looked like she had woken him. He wore only a loose pair of pajama pants. What is it? The question was gruff. I found something interesting in the storage tent, and I need you to come with me so we can take a better look. He betrayed no impatience with the task. Kerr simply nodded and followed her from his trailer. She was moving in almost a jog, but he still seemed to be curtailing his steps so he didn't overtake her. She couldn't have been away from the tent for more than 10 minutes, but by the time they slipped back inside and returned to the place where the crate had been, it was gone. She stared at the spot for a moment, evidence of it having been there by the dirt marring the canvas floor. It was right here. He frowned. What was? It was a crate full of these little ball things. She held up her hand in a rough estimate of the size. They were silver, but there seemed to be some kind of liquid in the center. It was a faint, luminescent yellow. I didn't get much of a look at it, and when I reached for one, Blorick told me not to touch. He seemed alarmed by the idea. Kerr frowned. Who's Blorick? It was her turn to frown at him. I assumed he works here? He was in the storage tent and… She trailed off, licking her lips as she gathered her courage to say the next words. He identified the crate as belonging to you, Kerr. He scowled. I don't know who Blorick is, and believe me when I say I know everyone who works for me. I also don't know anything about the crate, but I can guess what was inside. What? They sound like molecular grenades. They're a nasty bit of business, originally created by the Dizos when they were at war with the Corax. Blorick was a Corax. His eyes narrowed. We don't have any Corax in the Grotesquerie. Not many come to Earth since the horns make it difficult for them to fit in, even more so than the rest of us. She nodded. So Blorick doesn't work for you, and he isn't a part of the Grotesquerie? He didn't formally identify himself as being so, but he just seemed so knowledgeable. She shrugged. What is a molecular grenade? She hesitated to ask the question, because she didn't really want to know the answer. Once activated, it sends out a pulse wave that destroys the bond between molecules. Anything that comes in contact with the wave disintegrates. Nausea churned in her stomach as she imagined what the gangs could do with such weapons. We have to keep that from getting onto the streets. He nodded. I agree, but we don't even know where it went or where it came from. It might have compromised her objectivity, but she couldn't help uttering the words that slipped past her lips. Someone seems to be going to a lot of trouble to frame you, Kerr. He studied her for a moment, his gaze unblinking. Yes, they do. I'm surprised you reached that conclusion instead of assuming I was guilty, though. So was she, to be honest. It certainly wasn't her superior instincts, honed from a lifetime of being an agent. Her conviction that he was innocent came from a far different place, one that her superiors would have mocked her about if she had tried to insist he was innocent, based purely on a feeling. She just knew deep down that it couldn't be Kerr. He wasn't selfish or greedy enough to flood the market with technology that could kill thousands. She didn't know how she knew, but she was convinced he was a good person, and he would make every effort to do the right thing. After all, hadn't he withdrawn from her when the attraction was blatantly obvious between both of them, because it was the right thing to do? But if it was the right thing, why did it feel so wrong? Being separated from him like this felt just as wrong as the whole setup. She couldn't verbalize any of her perceptions or explain them in detail to him, so she simply shrugged. I'm keeping an open mind. I don't think you or Kex had anything to do with the weapons that are flooding the street, but someone clearly wants the department to think you did. You're naive at best, said Felix after she had shared the most recent information with him, along with her conviction that someone was setting up Kerr. He's obviously in the whole thing up to his eyeballs, Lauren. You're blinding yourself to the truth, for whatever reason. His gaze turned speculative, and there was a hint of disgust in his eyes. Are you sleeping with him? She surged to her feet, abandoning the couch where she slept to confront Felix. Standing toe-to-toe, she was almost a foot shorter than he was, but her anger at the accusation made up for the height difference. She wasn't angry that he would assume she would sleep with Kerr, but she was angry at the faint disgust he displayed at the idea, along with his own general blindness manifested by insisting Kerr was guilty. I haven't compromised the investigation, and I'm as objective as ever. I'm beginning to think you aren't, though, Agent Renton. His eyes widened and his nostrils flared. What's that supposed to mean? She put her hands on her hips as she leaned a little bit closer, pressing her face near his to emphasize her point. I'm stating bluntly that I think your objectivity is compromised. It's obvious that you've been convinced Kerr and Kex were guilty from the start, and you're doing your best to ensure the evidence supports that theory, rather than trying to find the truth. I'm not the one grasping at straws, Agent Sage. You have proof with your own eyes that he owns alien technology, identified as his property by another alien, and still you're grasping for any excuse to exonerate him. That identification came from a highly suspect source. Kerr doesn't employ any Corax on the Grotesquerie, and he'd never heard of Blorick. Of course he isn't going to admit to that, if the Corax outed him to you. Why can't you see he's guilty? Why can't you see he shouldn't be convicted without absolute proof? The same goes for Kex. Why do you hate them so much? The words slipped out as the epiphany overtook her. Why do you hate them, Felix? She asked the question more softly this time, modulating her tone to be reasonable. His shoulders slumped and he took a step back. I don't hate them personally. I just hate what they stand for. Just another group getting wealthy, while so many humans toil away and never see any of the reward. Her eyes widened. So it's an economic thing? He just shrugged a shoulder. Call me old-fashioned, but I don't really like it when I see aliens doing better than humans. This is our planet, and we should be dominating in every way, including economic. Lauren frowned at him as she crossed her arms over her chest. I think maybe you should recuse yourself from this investigation, Felix. His eyes widened and he looked startled. There's no need for that. He spoke gruffly, but his gaze was sincere. I don't like what they've accomplished, but it isn't clouding my judgment. I'm naturally cynical, and I don't believe you're cynical enough, but I suppose it's possible someone is setting up Kerr and his brother. I promise to entertain the idea, if you promise to consider the possibility that he isn't being set up, and he is guilty. Watch out for yourself and don't fall for him. He could manipulate those feelings and use you to hide his activities. You don't want the death of thousands on your conscience. She flinched at the words but nodded. She was still convinced Kerr had nothing to do with selling illegal alien technology, but she couldn't verbalize her reasons to Felix without further convincing him she had let her own judgment be clouded by the attraction she felt for Kerr. She wasn't prepared to admit that to anyone just yet, not even Kerr himself, and certainly not her partner, who already doubted her ability to remain unbiased. Chapter 5. The performance had been flawless. Lauren was now comfortable in her role, in fact so much so that she was able to forget she was actually an undercover agent instead of a performer during the height of the act. When Kerr tossed her into the air, she performed the best flip of her life, going higher than ever. She landed perfectly in his arms, and his wings enfolded her as he lit himself on fire. His head was bent down to accommodate his wingspan covering her, and when she looked up at him, it was completely natural to stretch on her tiptoes to press her lips to his. She held her breath as she waited to see if he would resist or push her away. After a brief hesitation, his lips molded to hers, and the kiss deepened. She lost herself in sensations, completely forgetting where she was, or what they were supposed to be doing. Apparently, he maintained a tighter grip on his control, because he lifted his head a moment later, with what appeared to be an expression of regret, as he stepped back, unfolding his wings and allowing her to move away from him. She blinked with returning awareness as she turned to the audience, performing a bow along with him. The show wrapped up a few minutes later, as it had during previous performances, and she waited off to the side, torturing herself with doubts. Would Kerr turn to her? Did he regret the kiss they had shared? Was she really prepared to risk compromising the investigation and sabotaging her fledgling career by sleeping with him? And would it ever be more than just sex if they did get involved? Lauren gave in to her doubts and turned, leaving the tent quickly. She was no longer planning to wait for Kerr to wrap up the various loose ends he dealt with on a nightly basis. Instead, she fled to her trailer and locked herself in. She didn't cry, because she wasn't in the mood for tears. She was simply lost in the throes of doubt and questioning how she was feeling and how she wanted to proceed. She was so immersed in her thoughts that someone knocking on the door made her jump. She moistened her lips as a dart of excitement shot through her. When she hurried across the small confines of the trailer, she opened the door without looking. In her heart, she had expected to see Kerr standing outside. The reality was far grimmer, and much more of a letdown. She struggled to hide her dismay when she recognized Talunta Vassos. What do you want? Talunta's eyes were wide, and she seemed to be almost frantic. I've come to warn you. The agent inside Lauren kicked in, and she opened the door wider to allow the alien to squeeze past before closing and locking the door. Her handgun was in the nightstand positioned near the futon bed, and she debated about going for it. Talunta put a hand on her arm, one of her wings blocking Lauren's path. I'm not in any danger, but you are. Lauren stilled, turning to look fully at Talunta as she temporarily abandoned the plan to get her gun. What do you mean, I'm in danger? There was sympathy in the alien woman's eyes, but it didn't seem genuine. It's obvious you're falling for Kerr, but you're just going to get your heart broken. He's still committed to his wife, and there's nothing a little human like you can do to change his opinion or his mind. If he couldn't break the heart bond when he was with me, he certainly won't with you. You should protect yourself from falling any deeper. It would be best to take your father and leave the grotesquerie. Lauren shrugged off the hand Talunta had placed on her shoulder, in a mocking gesture of empathy. I don't know what you're talking about, but it isn't your business. I think you should leave now. Talunta shrugged. I'm simply trying to do the right thing, human. After losing his bondmate, Kerr will never allow himself to commit to another. The only person he truly cares about these days besides himself is his brother, Kex. That's a bond no one could break. The way she spoke made Lauren's eyes narrow suspiciously. And have you tried to break that bond between them? Talunta gave her a false laugh. Why would I try to break the bond between brothers? Kerr and I had a brief relationship, but I knew there was no future in it. If there had been, I might have seen the need to weaken the bond between them. Kerr's lost the ability to love anyone but Kex. He would certainly be a threat to a new bondmate. She shrugged carelessly as she moved toward the door. It's your heart that will get broken if you don't listen. Don't say I didn't warn you. Thanks for the warning, said Lauren sarcastically. She was certain her lack of gratitude came through, but Talunta didn't reply as she slipped from the trailer. Before the door could close, it opened again as a hand appeared. This time, she didn't have even a sparkle of anticipation, because she recognized the all-too-human hand of her partner. She managed a professional smile as Felix stepped into her trailer. He was frowning over his shoulder at Talunta's departing form. When he looked at her, his expression was full of concern. What was she doing here? Lauren laughed, as though it had been a brief, entertaining visit rather than slightly unsettling. She came to warn me to steer clear of Kerr. She's clearly seeing things that aren't there. He grimaced. I'd think not. You're a human after all, and you're an agent. You're certainly not going to get involved with an alien. She frowned at him, not liking the prejudice he displayed. He wasn't the first agent she'd come across in her brief career who clearly regarded aliens as second-class citizens or worse, but it was always disturbing. Knowing Felix, trying to argue the position or get him to change his mind wouldn't do any good, so she just let it go. I have a new theory. He crossed his arms over his chest. Yeah, what is it? In Talunta's warning, she let it slip that she's jealous of Kex. She didn't state it outright that she herself felt threatened by him, but she warned me that Kex is the only person Kerr loves anymore. If she was trying to get rid of his brother, hoping to make Kerr vulnerable and turn to her, setting up Kex to be arrested and deported, seems like a good way to go about it. Felix looked mildly intrigued by the idea, before he lifted a shoulder in a shrug. I'm willing to entertain the possibility that she's behind all this, but I still think it's far more likely that Kerr is the ringleader. Maybe he and Talunta are working together to set up Kex. She started to argue that, her point being that he wouldn't have invited them into the show to investigate and find Kex innocent, if he had been setting up his brother to take the fall. She didn't get the chance though, because Felix's expression had darkened. I didn't come here to speculate about who's the smuggler. Those molecular grenades are hitting the market. Someone used one tonight to rob a bank in Chicago. They took out 4 walls and half the vault, along with a good portion of the money, but the authorities estimate they got away with at least $3 or $4 million. She let out a shaky breath. Was anyone hurt? He shook his head. They were in and out during a shift change, so whoever did the robbing must have been paying attention and observing the workings at the bank for weeks. It happened during the 6-minute stretch when there was no active patrol in the area, though it was all on camera. As he spoke, Felix pulled his phone from his pocket, extending it to her. She accepted the device, squinting at the screen, as she pressed the play button on the footage someone had sent Felix. She saw 4 people on the video, and they were all covered from head to foot. 3 of them appeared to certainly be human, but the 4th was tall and broad-shouldered. Though covered with a leather trench coat and a ski mask, along with a hat, she was certain that one wasn't human. He might have been Tartos, or perhaps a Korax. Bloric. For now, the Treasury Department and the FBI are keeping a media blackout on the information of how the robbers got in. They want this thing wrapped up quickly and quietly. You know, we're years away from making an announcement about extraterrestrial life, and probably decades from admitting that it's living right here on Earth alongside us. The department doesn't want this to be the way word leaks out ahead of time. She nodded as she returned his phone. I'm going to ask Kerr about Talunta. He knows her better than we do. He snorted, once again reminding her his favorite theory revolved around Kerr being involved. He didn't argue with her though, and he left the trailer a moment later. She was still in her costume, so she took a few moments to change into more comfortable clothing before seeking out Kerr. He wasn't at his trailer, but she wasn't surprised. He would likely be at one of the shows, or monitoring the entire operation in a hands-on fashion until the last customer left the grounds. She found him near the Selkie exhibit. The Havilon wasn't really a Selkie, of course. She could simply shed her skin and had a humanoid appearance. From previous observation, Lauren knew the Havilon was actually reusing skin she had shed a cycle ago, because she couldn't produce new skin every night. She still had the effect perfected, so that it looked like she was genuinely slipping from her skin to reveal her smooth form underneath. Since she had seen it before, it wasn't strange enough of a sight to keep her gaze for more than half a second as she stopped beside Kerr. Do you have a minute? He nodded, drawing her deeper into the shadows of the tent, his gaze still on the audience for a moment before he looked at her. What's up? Briefly, she told him about the grenades, and then she mentioned her theory about Talunta. He started shaking his head. I've already told you, I don't believe she's manipulative enough to behave in such a fashion. I won't discount the idea that she was jealous of my relationship with Kex, and I'll admit she's become clingier and more possessive than I can deal with, which is why she and I no longer have a casual relationship. I just don't think she would have done it this way. She would have gone after Kex directly if she wanted him out of the way. But if she killed him, you would never turn to her. He frowned. I would never turn to her anyway. It was an arrangement with mutual benefit, until it wasn't any longer. I think your theory is wrong. And I think you're being a typical man, refusing to see you've been manipulated. He arched a purple brow. I'm not a man. She waved a hand. Human or Dragarin, you're still a male. In my experience, men tend to be blind to the flaws in their partners. He smiled just slightly. I'll admit that could be true, but Talunta isn't and never was my partner. Lauren licked her lips. She said you'll never get over your heart bond. What is that? He looked vaguely uncomfortable. Dragorins mate for life. It's a serious undertaking, and you don't make the commitment lightly. Philandria might have died, but I'm still bound by my word. She wasn't certain how to interpret that. Did that mean he was still deeply in love with his bondmate, or was he simply acting in a proper fashion by honoring the promise he'd made to her to be faithful? If so, how did his sexual relationship with Talunta factor in? Did he consider that betrayal, or was it all right because it was simply physical on his side? They were the kind of questions that reintroduced the doubt she'd experienced earlier, making it easier for her to step away from him instead of leaning closer. That's all I needed to discuss. He seemed slightly puzzled, but he nodded. As she turned away, he made no attempt to call her back, though she thought for a moment he wanted to. It was in his gaze and the set of his body, but he never voiced the request. That was a good thing, because she might not have had the strength to refuse if he had asked her to stay. Chapter 6. Lauren wasn't certain if it was the heat or the sound that woke her. It could have even been the acrid scent in her nostrils, though not enough smoke had penetrated that section of the trailer to render her unconscious. She woke gasping and choking, abruptly aware of the flames around her. The smoke was thick, so she rolled out of bed and dropped to the floor. The floorboards burned her hands and knees because they were so hot. Tears trickled from her eyes from the smoke, and she coughed raggedly as she struggled to draw in a lungful of oxygen that wasn't available. The smoke was already scrambling her thought processes, but she was doing her best to gain her bearings and find the quickest way out of the small trailer. Flames blocked the only exit through the small door, and as she lifted her head, she confirmed what she already knew. The 2 windows in this section were far too small for her to squeeze through, even if she could have removed the rolling mechanism that opened them before the fire consumed the rest of the trailer. It was like a small tinderbox, and she didn't think she had more than 30 seconds before the flames reached her. She pounded on the side of the trailer, hoping someone nearby would realize she was still alive inside. Surely, the sight and smell of the trailer on fire would have drawn a crowd. The question was, would any of the aliens involved in the grotesquerie care that a human was burning alive? The flames leapt closer and she scooted back. She fell back on her butt, screaming at the pain as flames licked up her leg. The floorboards were hotter than ever, burning her palms and the tender flesh of her buttocks as she scooted back into the corner, pressing herself against the wall, which was also heated enough to burn the flesh of her back. She tried to scream, but she was too busy choking to manage any sound at all. Still, she heard a roar. For the briefest moment, Lauren thought it had somehow emerged from her, but when Kerr's form coalesced in the flames, she realized it must have been him. She lifted her arms, and he picked her up, folding her against his body and wrapping his wings around her as he rushed her from the trailer. They went right through the fire, but it clearly had no effect on him. As soon as they were outside and away from the flames, he parted his wings to allow her fresh air. She drew it in while gasping and choking, trying to clear the smoke from her lungs. She clung to him as he ran, not really aware that he was still holding on to her until he suddenly wasn't. Her eyes were still watering from smoke, but she managed to focus enough, though blurrily, to recognize she was inside his trailer. She tried to speak, but that only exacerbated her cough by making her lungs spasm. He knelt beside her, and she flinched when his fingers lightly brushed the section of burned skin. She could barely stand to look at it, horrified by how red it was. The sight of blisters already forming made her nauseated, which only complicated her ability to breathe. Kerr made a hissing sound, but her gaze was too blurry to make out why. A moment later, something warm and wet spilled on her leg. She wanted to ask what it was, but winced instead when he took her hand, pressing it against whatever liquid he put on her leg, before repeating the motion with the other hand. "Are you burned elsewhere?" She nodded, still coughing too hard to manage words. Instead, she lifted her hand to point at her back, frowning when she saw what looked like blood smeared across her palm. It was darker than human blood, with a purple cast to it, but she was certain that's what it was. As he eased her forward, carefully removing the tank top she'd worn to bed before rolling her onto her stomach, she was certain it was blood. There was a gash in his shoulder that hadn't been there before. At least she didn't think it had been there, though she had been too out of it to really notice. It was still bleeding somewhat freely, and her eyes widened with horror when she saw him press his hand to his wound, coming away slick with his own blood, before it disappeared behind her. A second later, the fluid leaked onto her back, and she grimaced. "What are you doing?" It was little more than a rasp, and she wasn't even certain he could hear her, let alone understand her words. Either he did comprehend her question, or he just assumed she'd be asking or wondering about his actions. Dragon blood has healing properties. If you're a compatible species, it should speed your healing significantly. My butt. He frowned at her. I don't understand. I burned my butt. She pushed out the words before surrendering to another coughing spell. It was a bit strange to feel his hands in her sleep shorts, but she didn't try to push him away when he peeled them down, along with her plain white panties. She grimaced when more of that liquid touched her buttocks. His blood. She shuddered at the thought, but couldn't deny that where he had touched her was already starting to feel better. Her leg didn't hurt nearly as badly, and the skin on her palms and her back were stinging less ferociously. That same soothing sensation flowed into her buttocks a moment later. You seem to be healing. He sounded satisfied. Human paramedics will be here to check on you soon, since I can't do anything for your breathing problems. She just nodded, still unable to speak. He might have done the same for anyone, but the act of spilling his blood to heal her seemed so intimate, as though forging a new bond between them. When he took her hand, holding it in his, she didn't try to pull away. She just squeezed lightly, wincing at the flare of pain, though it was nowhere near as severe as it had been. Keeping her hand in his felt right, and it was soothing as she waited for the paramedics. Lauren watched the ambulance drive away. Her chest still ached, and there was a tickle in the back of her throat, but she felt far better than she had before they had administered oxygen. Felix was frustrated and annoyed that she refused to go to the hospital for treatment, but she genuinely didn't feel the need. Even the paramedic had reluctantly admitted her oxygen saturation level was normal, and she no longer needed the oxygen. Since that was the only treatment the human doctors would likely do, she saw no reason to interrupt the investigation. She looked down discreetly at her hand, which was still slightly redder than usual, but it looked like a new layer of skin was already growing. Her leg was still the worst of it, where actual flames had burned her, but the blisters had disappeared and the skin was peeling. She looked like she had incurred a bad sunburn, rather than second-degree burns from a fire. I still think you should have gone to the hospital, said Felix. She just shrugged a shoulder. I'm okay. I'm not ready for a marathon, but I can get back to work soon enough. Her voice was deep and raspy, as though she'd been a smoker for 40 years, though she'd never touched a cigarette in her life, but that was to be expected for a few days. Looking put out, Felix sighed. Fine. I think there's a free bunk in the bunkhouse. She'll stay with me, said Kerr in a voice that brooked no argument. Apparently, Felix ignored that. His eyes narrowed. Why would she stay with you? That's a terrible idea. Kerr arched a brow. Someone tried to kill her this evening. You're suggesting she'd be safer sleeping in an open bunk room than she would on the pull-out sofa in my living room? Felix opened his mouth, looking like he wanted to argue for a moment, before he closed it with a click. I see your point. I guess she'll be safe as long as it's your living room. He put special emphasis on the last two words. Lauren flushed, uncertain if it was from anger or embarrassment when she realized Felix was warning off Kerr. She rolled her eyes. Thanks for your concern, but I'll be fine, Agent Renton. Felix looked vaguely offended, but he shrugged. I hope you will, Agent Sage. Grumbling under his breath, he turned and walked away from them, without saying another word. She shook her head as she met Kerr's gaze. He's taking his role of father way too seriously. Her attempt at levity did nothing to make either one of them smile. He simply led her into his trailer, making a shooing motion to the few aliens who were still hanging around. It had been like their own private show, and she cynically wondered how many had been betting if she would live or die. She followed him into the trailer, and he closed the door behind them, locking it securely. "May I have some water?" He seemed to have no trouble understanding her rasp, and he turned from her to take a glass from the cabinet. A moment later, he extended it filled with tap water. She took the glass, drinking greedily. It had to be at least her 8th in the last hour, but it soothed her throat, which was still an aching mess. The rest of her felt pretty good comparatively, and she wished her chest and her throat would heal as rapidly as her burns were. "I'd like to see your wounds." She held out her hands after putting down the glass, palms up. "They're almost fully healed." He frowned slightly. "We must be highly compatible." He sounded almost unhappy about that. She frowned at him. "I guess so, and I consider that a good thing." He shrugged. "It is a good thing. I just didn't realize our species were so compatible. We must be if my DNA can influence yours." She frowned at him. "What does DNA have to do with it? I thought it was some kind of healing enzyme." He looked like he wanted to say more, but finally just lifted his shoulder in a shrug. "Perhaps it is. It doesn't matter since it worked. I'd like to see your back, if I may. It was worse than your hands." Lauren wasn't certain what possessed her, but an urge came over her that she couldn't fight. Still looking at him and still facing him, she grasped the hem of her tank top, which was badly damaged and had threadbare spots from the heat. Maintaining eye contact, she slowly pulled the material up and over her head, revealing her bare skin beneath. Kerr made a sound in the back of his throat, and his gaze was temporarily locked on the lushness of her breasts, which were just slightly too large for her frame. It seemed to cost him quite an effort to wrench his gaze away, and he sounded gruff when he said, "Turn around." She did as he asked, slowly turning away from him to show her back. She held her breath as she waited to see if he would say or do anything. "You look almost fully healed. There's still some pinkness, but it's like new skin." As he spoke, his fingers caressed down her spine. Soft and smooth. No hint of damage. His voice had gotten rougher, taking on a smoky tinge, and she shivered in delight when his lips ghosted down the curve of her lower back, his hands moving away. His mouth went lower, his lips briefly brushing against the dimple of her buttocks, before he pulled away. He cupped the globes in his hands, massaging gently. "Smooth as silk here too." He whispered the words against her ear as he leaned closer to her. Lauren melted against him, her back pressed against his smooth chest. It felt like they were moving too swiftly in some ways, but after almost dying, she wanted to feel alive, and she wanted him. When he lifted her and carried her to his room, she sighed and surrendered against him, as they became lovers. The bliss seemed to last forever, but he abruptly withdrew from her as she was coming down from her release. She frowned as he moved toward the bathroom. "Are you all right? Our species might be more compatible than we'd like, and I didn't know if you were protected." His words explained everything. She nodded and laid back as he spent a moment cleaning up. By the time he returned, her eyes were heavy, and she was almost asleep. She managed to roll over just enough to allow him room to curve behind her, and she surrendered to sleep, feeling secure as he spooned her. "Does it have a special meaning?" She asked the question as she trailed her fingers down the purple emblem on his skin. It was a darker shade than the rest of him, with a faint luminescence even without the stage makeup he used to enhance it for performances. He trapped her hand against his chest with his own. "It's my family's royal crest." Her eyes widened. "Royal?" At his nod she frowned slightly. "Is that the same for your people as mine? Are you a prince?" She'd thought the Lord honorific in Fire Lord was just part of the name of the act, and a stage name, but now she wondered. He shook his head. I was a minor lord. I was never going to lead anything, which was fine with me. I always preferred the arts and entertainment. She arched a brow. The royal family didn't find it strange that one of their relatives wanted to perform? He smiled. On my planet, entertaining, particularly acting, is one of the highest forms of art. I was gifted at it, and it was obvious it was my destiny from the time I was a young dragoran. He grimaced. I dislike that word. Your department bestowed it on our people, because they couldn't pronounce our planet, our species, or even my last name. She nodded, having read that in the files. You're not the only species we've done that to. He shrugged. It's understandable, I suppose. He spoke a long, incomprehensible string of sounds to her. That's my family name. So Dracos it is, she said with a small smile. He frowned suddenly. How's your throat? She blinked. It doesn't hurt at all. The words seemed to trouble him, and he pulled away from her abruptly. There are things I must do. Rest for now. She started to protest, wanting to insist she didn't need to rest. He was gone before she could do so, though. She took a moment to appraise her condition, finding her throat was completely without discomfort. Her hands were totally healed, and the new skin look had disappeared. It looked like she had regenerated all layers of her epidermis. Her leg still bore some signs of injury, but it was much better as well. She couldn't see her back or her buttocks, but she assumed they would be like her hands, which were nearly in the same state of healing, or healed as the case may be. Whatever was in his blood had certainly worked wonders for her. Why did he seem so upset about that? She shrugged as she rolled out of bed, deciding to get dressed and find Felix. He was likely to be worried about her, and it was clear someone didn't like their presence in the Grotesquerie. They would want the investigation wrapped up, and apparently they were willing to get rid of Felix and Lauren to ensure that happened. Unless it had nothing to do with the investigation, which was supposed to be a tightly guarded secret. Anger spread through her as a possibility stood out. To Lunta. The other woman found her a threat, but had she done something so drastic as set fire to Lauren's trailer and try to kill her? As she raided Kerr's drawers in search of garments that might fit her, since everything she owned had been destroyed in the fire, she vowed she was going to track down to Lunta and find out. Chapter 7. Before she could go looking for Lunta, Kerr approached her. There was an air of urgency about him, and his lips were clamped tight in anger. Where is your part, father? He darted a glance around as he made the correction, before lowering his voice significantly. There's someone you need to interrogate, in an official capacity. Automatically, Lauren reached into her pocket before remembering two things. It wasn't her pocket, but a pair of drawstring waist pants she had liberated from his closet and cut off using a pair of kitchen shears, and her communicator wasn't inside the pocket anyway. It had been destroyed in the fire in her trailer, like everything else. I'm not sure. I don't know how to get hold of him without my phone. We'll just have to look for him. Kerr sighed impatiently, but nodded. I'll fly overhead, and if you see me land, head for that direction. Otherwise, search on your side. As soon as she nodded, he broke into flight. As always, when he wasn't camouflaged, it was a stunning and elegant sight, but she couldn't allow herself to be distracted by it or spend time staring at him flying away. Instead, she turned her attention to finding Felix. She moved through the crowd of workers, all practicing or preparing for the night's performance, pausing to ask if any had seen Felix along the way. The few who bothered to answer her always answered in the negative, before immediately returning to their own work and ignoring her. She was getting frustrated when she saw Kerr circle around before he started to dive. She headed in that direction, seeing he had found Felix. It took her a few minutes to work her way across the fairgrounds, and when she reached where Kerr had landed, he was moving through the crowd toward her, Felix in tow beside him. Her partner looked reluctant, or perhaps just irritated, but he was walking alongside Kerr. "What's this all about?" asked Felix brusquely when they met. "Kerr needs us to interrogate someone." He arched a brow. "Who?" "Anasta," said Kerr as he herded them toward one of tents used for practice. "The Havilon?" asked Lauren as Felix also spoke. "Who's that?" asked her partner. Kerr nodded at Lauren, not bothering to answer Felix. "After last night, I was determined to find answers. Anasta has some for you, though she was reluctant at first." Felix looked interested now. "What kind of answers?" "I'll let her tell you." As they entered the tent, Lauren saw the Havilon in a chair, hands bound behind her back. "You tied her up." Kerr shrugged. "I didn't want her to change her mind and run off to warn Blorick." She twitched at the sound of the Corax's name. "What does Blorick have to do with anything?" Felix squared his shoulders. "Let's find out." He moved closer to the Havilon, lifting his hand to shake her shoulder. He made an ambiguous sound as he pulled away, the fatal wound inflicted to Anasta's neck visible to them all. She looked at Kerr in surprise. "What happened?" He seemed troubled. "I don't know. She was alive when I left her." Felix cast a skeptical glance at Kerr. "She isn't now. What was it she was supposed to tell us?" His tone revealed he wasn't likely to believe anything Kerr said. Lauren resisted the urge to glare at him, though she was off-kilter by the turn of events herself. "Anasta has been involved with an illegal alien for at least the last 2 years. She told me he follows us, the show I mean, from town to town, and he slips into her trailer most nights." "Blorick?" asked Lauren. At his nod she said, "I wonder why he didn't just apply for refugee status or a work visa." "He knew he wouldn't have a chance in hell of getting it," said Felix. "He's probably a criminal on his world." Kerr shrugged. "That was the impression I got, but your database at the department should be able to confirm that." She said until the last few months, Blorick worked a series of odd jobs under the table, and he struggled to make ends meet. Then he started flashing cash, and he was no longer having to take the jobs no one else wanted. At first, when Anasta questioned him about it, she said Blorick was evasive. Finally, he admitted to her that he'd found a source of income, and that the money would only grow. He was trying to persuade her to leave the Grotesquerie, but she was afraid he had gotten involved in something illegal. Last night he called her, pleading with her to leave the show and meet him in Chicago. He told her their worries were over, and she needed to trust him. She was actually in the process of seeking me out when I came across her. "To tell you she was leaving?" asked Felix. Kerr shook his head. "No, she was coming ask me for help. She was hoping I could find a way to intercede on Blorick's behalf, or at least help extract him from whatever mess he had gotten caught up in. I don't know what he was into, but it makes sense that he might have been the source of the alien technology. I'm not entirely certain how he acquired it, but I think he was clearly a link in the chain." Kerr looked at Anasta before looking away, his expression somewhere between angry and sad. "I have a hard time believing Blorick killed his girlfriend, so I think it's obvious there's still someone else involved, but maybe it brings you closer to wrapping up the investigation." Lauren felt a pang shoot through her chest at the thought, and she wasn't thrilled at the response. She should be eager to wrap this up and move on to the next case, not experiencing a rush of anxiety at the idea of walking away from Kerr. Hadn't she had this discussion with herself last night already? What had happened was something strictly physical, and she couldn't allow it to influence her emotions or the investigation. Felix snorted. I believe part of your theory, but would you like to hear mine? Kerr's shoulders stiffened, and he was clearly on the defensive just from Felix's tone. Of course, Agent Renton. I think you came across the Havilon, but I don't think she was coming to you for help. I think you intercepted her when she was coming to one of us for help, or perhaps planning to leave your show. I think she knew more than you wanted us to find out. Kerr gritted his teeth, his expression one of anger. What is it you imagine I didn't want her to reveal? You didn't want her to tell us you're the one in charge of distributing the weapons. We know Blorick exists because Lauren ran across him, but it's more likely he's working for you than he's sneaking around and following the Grotesquerie from town to town. Maybe you killed her to deflect the blame from you, or perhaps you killed her to keep her from leaving. I think it's obvious Blorick was involved in what happened in Chicago last night, but the question is if he had your permission to do it, or if he was going out on his own. Did he get tired of working for you for peanuts, and decide to use the alien technology in a way that would liberate him from you? Kerr took a step forward, and Lauren acted instinctively by placing her body between the two men. She wasn't certain whom she was protecting. She knew Kerr could hurt Felix badly, but she suspected she acted so quickly to keep him from facing the consequences of doing so more than she did to protect her fellow agent. She should be embarrassed or ashamed by that, but she was angry on Kerr's behalf at Felix's short-sightedness and insistence on clinging to the belief he was the one responsible for the weapons. I had nothing to do with A.I.D.'s death, and I'm not involved with distributing weapons. Neither is my brother. You're awfully fond of that theory, Agent Renton. I wonder if you're able to see the truth past your own conclusions? Felix shrugged and turned away. I'll call in a team to deal with this mess. It'll have to be discreet, or our cover will be blown. Kerr roared at him. A.I.D.'s murder isn't a mess. It's a crime and a tragedy, but she's not something to clean up and sweep under the rug. Felix just shook his head and walked farther away, pulling out his communicator. Lauren turned away from Felix to face Kerr, taking his hand in hers. He can be insensitive at times, but it really is standard operating procedure to have a team quietly deal with any incident like this. If a local coroner got hold of A.I.D.'s body, humans might learn about the existence of aliens far ahead of when the department is prepared to divulge the information. She squeezed his hands. I promise they'll treat your friend with utmost respect. He nodded, and his anger seemed to fade away, at least partially. What do you think of your partner's theory? She didn't hesitate. I don't believe it. He took a step toward her. Why not? Lauren rolled her eyes. You can ask me that after last night? She pitched her reply low so that Felix wouldn't overhear. If I ever believed that you were involved in distributing illegal alien technology, or that you're capable of murdering someone like A.I.D., I wouldn't have slept with you. He looked satisfied, though he was still clearly upset. This means someone in the Grotesquerie is working against us, using everything I've built, and everyone's hard work, to disguise their illegal activities. They're willing to kill to do so, and A.I.D. was innocent. The only crime she was guilty of was loving a shady man. Felix returned to them before Lauren could formulate a reply. The team will be here within an hour. They'll include forensics investigators, so don't go too far, Kerr. I'm certain they'll want to test your hands for the Havilon's blood. Kerr glowered at him. I welcome any tests they wish to perform. Felix just shrugged, turning away from them. The agents arrived sooner than expected, and the investigation was conducted quietly, quickly, but thoroughly. Felix insisted on one of the technicians testing Kerr's body and clothing for any trace of Haviland blood, but he came up clean. Lauren was annoyed by Felix's air of disappointment when the test came back negative, and she shared Kerr's doubt that he could move past his prejudice or preconceived idea of guilt to find who was truly guilty. It was something she would have to discuss with the director, but that would have to wait. For now, she was still undercover. She was able to acquire a new communicator from one of the agents sent to investigate, though, and Director Simmons had thoughtfully sent along a case of her clothing, probably collected by another agent. After the agents left, Anasta's body carefully wrapped in a bag and taken with them, Lauren parted from Kerr and Felix to return to the trailer to get ready for the evening's performance. It had been a long day, preceded by a restless night, though she couldn't complain about why she had lost sleep, so she was dragging a bit with her preparations. She was later than she'd planned to be as she slipped from Kerr's trailer and made her way backstage. She still had to don makeup, but she already wore the performance leotard. Since she was running a bit late, the usual chaos of everyone else getting ready at the same time was missing. She was slightly surprised to have the large makeup table and mirror completely to herself, but sat down and started applying cosmetics. In the process of putting on the blush, she accidentally knocked against the container, sending it to the floor. With a small curse, she bent over to pick it up, freezing as the sound of shattering glass came from above her. Acting on instinct, Lauren rolled out of the chair and spun around, crouching on the floor. She darted a glance at the mirror, which was now shattered into 1,000 pieces by the knife, centered right in the middle. If she hadn't knocked over the blush and bent down, the knife would have been in the back of her head instead. It was no shock to see Talunta standing a few feet away from her, a handful of throwing knives at the ready. "I knew it was you who torched my trailer." Lauren carefully stood up, her mind racing. "And yet you still refuse to die. I should have just done it this way to start with." As she spoke, she threw one of the knives, her purple hair flowing around her face when she laughed gleefully as it sank into Lauren's shoulder. "This will be much more fun anyway. I get the pleasure of watching you die up close." Lauren had whimpered when the knife hit her flesh, but she gritted her teeth and pulled it free. "I'm stronger than you think." As she spoke, she flicked the knife back at Talunta. Considering she had absolutely no experience throwing knives, it came closer to hitting the alien than she'd expected, though it sailed over her head and sank into the tent post behind her. "You're an irritating pain, human. I don't know what he sees in you, but you have to go." Lauren tried to duck as another knife flew her way, this time slicing across her arm, but not lodging in her flesh. She let out a hissing sound of pain as she clamped her hand over it, trying to watch warily to see what Talunta would do next. The other woman was down to her last 2 knives, and she moved so quickly that Lauren had no chance to evade. One moment the blades were in Talunta's hands, and the next they flew through the air and entered her flesh. One lodged in her shoulder blade, which was excruciating, but not likely to be life-threatening. However, the other was right above her heart. As soon as the blade came out, she'd probably bleed to death. She dropped to the floor, helpless to move for a moment as Talunta approached. She tried to stop her by lifting her hand when Talunta reached down to take the knife from her chest. She offered more resistance than Talunta expected, and the other woman had to tug forcefully to remove the weapon. Lauren anticipated bleeding to death in seconds, so she was surprised that only a trickle seemed to be flowing from the wound. She touched it, hiding it with her hand as though she could heal her skin just by pressing it together. Was she? It was a strange thought, but as she probed the wound, she swore she could feel it healing. She was in pain, of course, but not nearly as incapacitated as she would have expected after being stabbed through the heart, or at least directly above it. Talunta clicked her teeth together to create a strange sound. "How careless of me to miss your heart. I won't make that mistake again. As the alien lifted the knife, clearly prepared to plunge it downward in a stabbing motion instead of bothering with throwing it, Lauren gritted her teeth and pulled the knife from her shoulder with a small scream. As Talunta bent forward, she surged upward with her blade, stabbing the alien in the stomach. Talunta reared back, shock on her face. She stumbled and fell, sitting on her buttocks as she cupped her stomach. She was clearly having difficulty processing the sudden change of events, from what she had expected to what had actually happened. But how? Lauren didn't know, and she didn't take time to speculate. Instead, she fumbled on the makeup table for the communicator she had left there, since the leotard held no pockets. It wasn't just a communicator, but it was also a backup device to protect herself. She fired the taser without warning, incapacitating Talunta. When she released the button to stop the voltage, the prongs popped loose and Talunta was on the floor, unconscious. Since she had no handcuffs or other means to confine the dragger in, she used several scarves from the costume props to tie Talunta from head to toe, with her wrists bound and her arms tied at her side. She was still acting on adrenaline, so she called the department before she allowed herself to collapse to the floor near Talunta, who was still unconscious. Then she lifted the communicator, using Felix's frequency to alert her partner to the situation. After that, she started to tremble. Her body shook as she waited for him but couldn't stop the rattles shaking her frame, until she heard Kerr's voice. She looked up at him, somewhat surprised to see him, though she assumed he was looking for her because the show was about to start. He rushed toward her, his purplish skin moving toward a gray cast as he took in the situation. I heard you calling for me. She frowned. You intercepted the communicator? He shook his head, but didn't explain further. Instead, he simply bent down and lifted her into his arms, holding her against him. Are you injured? She started to tell him she was, but when she touched the largest wound on her chest, where the knife had buried inches deep into her flesh, she found nothing more than a slight scratch. I was, but I'm not now. She looked down. It healed. She touched her arm and her shoulder as well, finding both wounds completely closed over now. They all healed. She looked at him in shock. How did that happen? His lips tightened, but he didn't offer an explanation. He didn't speak again until Felix arrived, and then he set her down in the chair she had abandoned when Talunta attacked, nodded to both of them, and left. She tried not to take his leaving personally, but she longed to have him with her. Felix wanted to know what had happened, and she gave him a brief rundown, but was forced to repeat it all less than an hour later when more agents arrived. There were a few faces from earlier, along with a few new ones. They seemed less worried about remaining low-key this time, and they quickly arrested Talunta, bundling her into the back of an ambulance to transport her for medical care before taking her to a holding cell. She had roused at some point but had remained unspeaking. She had the right to remain silent, and she'd clearly decided to exercise it. Physically, Lauren could have done the performance, but emotionally, she wasn't up for it. With a start, she realized it was almost over anyway, so Kerr must have done his usual routine he had devised before she became part of his act. The idea upset her, though that was illogical. The show must go on, whether you're a human on Broadway or a draggerin in the Grotesquerie. She wasn't upset that he had continued with the act so much as the fact that he had left her, without even a backward glance. She was surprised to see Director Simmons arrive, and Felix seemed equally startled as well. The director nodded toward Felix, but went straight to Lauren. I'm pulling you out. Lauren shook her head. You can't do that. My cover is still secure. The director frowned, clearly doubtful. You've been involved in 2 incidences in 2 days. Someone's trying to kill you. I don't think it's a good idea for you to stay here any longer, Agent Sage. For your own protection. Lauren held up a hand insistently, but not necessarily rudely, to interrupt her boss. The person who tried to kill me is now in the department's custody. It was an isolated incident. There were two. Lauren nodded. I think I phrased that wrong. I meant her reason for attacking me had nothing to do with our investigation. She still has no idea that I'm part of the department, and she thinks Felix is my father. Director Simmons frowned. If it wasn't because of the investigation, what possible reason would she have to attack you? Lauren's face heated with a blush, and she lowered her voice slightly. She was jealous. She believes there's something more between Lord Dracos and myself than there actually is. That wasn't technically a lie, was it? Talunta was jealous of what she perceived as their forming relationship. It seemed completely obvious to Lauren that there was no relationship involved. For Kerr, it had strictly been physical. For her, that's what it should have been, though she suspected it had become more. Either way, that was over. It had to be. The director made a small sound that was ambiguous, but could have been expressing her understanding. I see. In that case, I'll leave the call up to you, Agent Sage. If you're sure your cover isn't blown, then we'll keep you on the assignment. We have to be close to a breakthrough. Lauren nodded her agreement. I believe we are. I'm sure we'll have this wrapped up soon, and I'd like to stay on my assignment. The director nodded. Very well. Carry on then, Agent Sage. She turned around, nodded briefly to Felix again without approaching him, and left the scene. Lauren was a bit surprised by her abrupt withdrawal, but it made sense. She'd come to retrieve or extract Lauren, and since Lauren had declined, she was leaving the rest of the investigation to her team, who were all competent and knew what to do. She was certain they were close to solving the case, but she had a new mystery of her own to unravel. How had she healed from the injuries Talunta inflicted? Had Kerr's enzymes remained in her blood? That was the most logical explanation, though it seemed strange that they had lasted for more than 24 hours when they'd been applied topically. Only the wound on her leg had actually had broken skin, and could have allowed his blood into her body. Protocol suggested she should turn herself over to the lab at the department to get a complete workup and determine if there were any lasting effects from the Dragarin enzymes, but she didn't have time for that. She didn't want to risk the investigation by pulling out in the middle of it, and she was reluctant to leave Kerr. That was a foolish reaction, and she knew she was only setting herself up for further heartbreak the longer she remained, but she couldn't walk away just yet. Chapter 8. Kerr didn't come to his trailer that night. She had already set herself up on the couch to sleep, determined not to repeat last night's mistake. It hadn't felt like a mistake at the time, but after his clear withdrawal from her, he clearly regarded it as so. If she had a bit of common sense when it came to him, she would be doing the same. Apparently, she had at least a tiny iota, because she had no intention of sleeping with him again. She wished she was more confident in that decision than she felt. She had a sneaking suspicion that if he showed any desire for her, her resolve would crumble. Perhaps it was a relief when he didn't return to his own trailer and tempt her, even in an abstract way, but she was still angry and hurt. She slept poorly, though the pull-out sofa in his living room was more comfortable than the futon bed she had used in the small trailer. She just couldn't seem to get comfortable or shut down her mind enough to stop tossing and turning. It was barely past dawn when there was a tentative knock at the trailer door. She rolled out of bed, still in her pajama pants and tank top, delivered courtesy of the director yesterday, and decided that was dressed enough. It was unlikely it would be Kerr knocking on his own trailer, and Felix would have knocked more forcefully. She glanced through the window on the door before opening it, not recognizing the alien standing in front of her. She was a Dragarin, but unfamiliar. Yes. My name is Riata, and I'm here because of my sister. Lauren grimaced. Talunta. She ventured a guess. At the other woman's nod, she stepped back with a sigh and allowed her to enter. What were the odds that both sisters would be homicidal maniacs? She didn't really want to speculate on that, did she? She waved to the kitchen table, since the couch was still made up as a bed. Have a seat. Would you like coffee? Riata shook her head. She sat down, and her posture was dejected. I've come to plead with you to spare Talunta. With a longing look at the caffeine she didn't take time to ingest, Lauren sat across from her, frowning at the alien. I'm not certain what you mean by sparing Talunta. Tears with the faintest trace of purple in them streaked from her eyes and down her cheeks. Please don't banish her. She's all I have left. Lauren shook her head. That's not up to me. I'm just a she started to say lowly agent but cut off abruptly. She attacked me. I have nothing to do with what happens to her. Riata shook her head. I know you're with the department, and you must have some authority over what happens to my sister. Lauren reeled back, slumping against the bench. How do you know I'm an agent? There was just the faintest smirk on Riata's lips, and it flashed so briefly she almost missed it. Someone I know identified you as agents with the Alien Immigration and Integration Department. He said you must be here to stop the flow of illegal alien technology. Her mind was spinning. You know about that too? Riata shrugged before her gaze darted delicately toward Kerr's closed bedroom door, before moving to the couch where Lauren had been sleeping. There are few secrets here, but there are incorrect inferences from time to time. Lauren clenched her hands together as she realized the entire show thought she and Kerr were lovers. It wasn't their business, and she certainly wasn't going to bother to deny it. Fine. You know I'm an agent, but I'm not sure what you expect me to do for Talunta, or even why I should try to do anything for her. Riata licked her lips. You could have killed her, but you didn't. For that, I owe you a blood debt. Lauren shook her head. You don't owe me anything. I would have killed your sister if I had to. I was determined to survive. Riata lifted her shoulder in a shrug. Be that as it may, she's alive, and that's thanks to you. I have no right to ask you for anything more, but I have information for you. In return, I want your promise that you'll spare my sister. What kind of information? Anasta was my lover, and I know things she knew, and things I put together on my own. Lauren frowned. I thought she was with Blorick. Riata shrugged. She was. Havilons are bisexual by nature. I understood that about her, though I had no interest in Blorick. We interacted, of course, and he was the one who said you were agents. If you make the call to your department to arrange a pardon for Talunta, I'll tell you everything I know. Hesitantly, Lauren stretched and reached for her communicator, still on the table near the couch. She put it on the table and stared at it. I could promise you that, but it would be a lie. I don't have the kind of power or influence required to ensure your sister gets a full pardon. To be honest, she doesn't deserve a full pardon. You must know she could be dangerous. At most, I might be able to persuade the director to agree to inject her with a tracking device, and she would be subject to continuous monitoring. She wouldn't be deported, but in a way, that fate might be worse. Riata cocked her head slightly. How so? Lauren licked her lips. If she breaks the terms of her probation, there's an option in the implant that allows the department to shut her down. By that, I mean all of her life functions. They would send a strong voltage through her that would interrupt normal functioning of her cardiovascular and nervous systems. In other words, if she violates the terms of her agreement, she would be dead, not just banished. Riata looked troubled for a moment, but then she sighed and nodded. I prefer those terms and accept on her behalf. It's better than being banished to Terria 7. Lauren wasn't entirely certain about the legality of Riata agreeing to the terms for her sister, but she lifted her device and requested to be put through to the director. At first, Director Simmons was reluctant to negotiate, but when Lauren pressed home the point Riata had information that could solve the case, the director issued a long sigh before capitulating. "I have your word?" asked Riata, who had been on speaker for the conversation. "I give you my word," said Director Simmons. "The caveat is your sister can choose banishment over continuous monitoring. Are you agreeable to those terms?" "I am." Riata looked serene. "Tell us what we need to know," said the director. Riata shook her head. "Not like this, on a device that can be intercepted by anyone. I'll only divulge it in person, at the department, and only directly to you. You'll have to tell Agent Sage before she brings you in." Riata hesitated, but then shook her head again, her gaze almost apologetic when she met Lauren's. "I'm sorry, but I can't do that. There's a possibility Agent Sage has been compromised." Lauren reeled back at the information, finding it difficult to breathe for a moment. Was Riata implying what she thought she was? If she believed Kerr was her lover, she would have good reason to think Lauren was compromised. The only reason that would worry her, though, was if Kerr was truly the one behind trafficking the technology. "Very well, Miss Vassos. Do you want Agent Sage to bring you in, or do you prefer an extraction team?" "I'd like a team, please. But only people you trust implicitly." "Very well. I'll send a helicopter to collect you as soon as possible. Agent Sage, keep her safe until then." "I will, Director Simmons." Lauren tried not to take it personally that Riata didn't trust her. It stung her professional pride, but she could move past that. Riata was crucial to their investigation, and if she wanted to share her information directly with the director instead of Lauren, she couldn't let herself get into a snit that over that. The director disconnected the line a moment later, and Lauren moved the communicator slightly to the side. She stared at Riata, her gaze probing. "Why do you believe I'm compromised?" "The company you keep," said Riata with a small sigh. "You seem like a good human, but I can't trust you." The door to the trailer opened then, and she looked up in expectation, thinking it would be Kerr. Instead, Felix stood there. Lauren smiled at him, happy to have his assistance in protecting Riata. She assumed Director Simmons had contacted him. Riata stiffened when she saw him, and then her gaze darted to Lauren. "Why is he here?" "He's my partner," said Lauren. "I'm here to do what's necessary," said Felix. As he spoke, he lifted his gun and shot Riata in the head. Lauren blinked in shock as the Dragoran slumped forward, her eyes glassy and completely lacking awareness. She frowned at Felix, mind whirling with confusion. "Why did you do that? She was no threat to me. She has information on the investigation." "I know." Felix sounded almost regretful when he turned the gun on her, firing 3 times. Chapter 9. Lauren woke in confusion, trying to identify her location. The sun was bright overhead, and she was staring directly into it. She closed her eyes as the sun left an afterimage burning behind her eyelids for a long minute. She didn't open them again, as she struggled to remember what had happened, and to discern where she was. Lying perfectly still, she just listened for a moment until she identified the sound of rushing water. Taking in a deep breath, she identified the scent of wildflowers, along with the smell of blood and gunpowder. She jerked when she heard a curse, recognizing Felix's voice. It came rushing back then, and the pieces quickly fell into place. When Riata had assumed she might be compromised by the company she kept, Kerr hadn't been the problem. It was Felix. Her mentor, her partner and the senior agent, was involved with moving the alien technology. Disappointment welled in her, along with a strong dose of sadness on Riata's behalf. No wonder the Dragoran had insisted on only speaking to Director Simmons. Lauren winced as she remembered her promise to keep Riata safe, a promise she hadn't been able to fulfill. Cautiously, she turned her head slightly to the side to avoid the full punishing rays of the sun, and slitted her eyes open. She barely held in a cry of shock when she found herself staring at the Corax she had encountered at the Grotesquerie. Blorick laid beside her, a large hole in his forehead. Cold flesh pressed against her other side, but she was afraid to turn her head to identify the other body sharing her space. It was most likely Riata, though it could have been any number of people Felix had decided were a risk to him. He cursed again, and she tentatively identified his location as off to her left. Moving slowly, so slowly that she hoped he wouldn't notice the slight motions of her head, she tipped her head in his direction. After what felt like hours, she was finally positioned to be looking away from Blorick, and what she hoped would be Felix in her line of sight. She allowed her eyelids to open just slightly, once again making them slits. Looking past the purple wing obscuring the edge of her vision, she sought out Felix. He was using some kind of hoist system, and there were concrete blocks and chains beside him. She didn't have to know the finer details of his plan to realize he intended to weigh them all down with the cinder blocks and chains, before tossing them in the river. It wasn't likely to be a permanent way to hide their bodies, but it would buy him enough time to do whatever he planned next, which likely involved disappearing with the money he had accumulated from selling the technology. Without thinking about it, her thoughts went straight to Kerr, and she wished she was there with him. She silently called out his name, allowing a brief moment of weakness as she wished for him to swoop in and rescue her. Since that wasn't happening, she had to get herself out of this mess. She had at least one advantage. Her hands were unbound, as were her feet. After being shot 3 times, including once to the head, Felix had rightfully concluded she was dead. Had she been, or at least had her vital signs been so suppressed, that he had concluded she was if he bothered to check. He certainly hadn't expected her to heal, but then again, neither had she. Right now, he believed she was as dead as her companions on the riverbank, which meant she had to use that surprise to her advantage. After a bit more cursing, and the clanking of chains, Felix turned away from what he was doing, and approached the 3 of them lying on the ground. She quickly slammed her lids shut, hoping he would choose Riata beside her first. It bought her a little more time if he focused on that body for disposal, rather than going straight for her. She got her wish when she felt Riata's corpse being pulled away from her. With more cursing and grunting, Felix must have finally accomplished whatever he was doing, because there was a loud splash several minutes later. She winced on the alien's behalf, hoping she would be able to help agents locate the body, and that she wasn't going to join her in the water. Felix turned to Blorick next, to her relief. It took him longer to deal with Blorick's body, and that was likely because he was so much larger than Riata or Lauren. There was more cursing involved too, but she was happy to hear it, because each foul word that left his mouth meant he was still dealing with disposing of the other alien first. Once he stopped cursing, he would be turning his attention to her. The splash of Blorick's body hitting the river came a moment later, and she tensed as she prepared herself. She waited until he bent down to grasp her ankles before moving. It was nerve-wracking waiting those precious milliseconds, but she was afraid to act too quickly. At the last moment, when he was least likely to be able to maintain his balance, she bent her knees and kicked forward as hard as she could. He grunted, his expression one of shock as he went flying away from her. He landed awkwardly on his side and rolled a few feet, but stopped before hitting the water. Lauren jumped to her feet, gaze frantically searching for a weapon. There was nothing available, except for the cinder blocks and heavy chains, and she doubted she could repurpose them into a manageable weapon. With no alternative, she turned and ran. She didn't hear the gunfire, but she heard a bullet hit a tree beside her, and realized he was using a sound suppressor, or some type of alien weapon. If he was using a sound suppressor, did that mean they were near civilization, or had he simply used it back at the show, and hadn't bothered to remove it yet? She tried to think if she remembered hearing the bullets he had fired, but it was all sort of a blank, lost to a combination of adrenaline and trauma from the injuries she had sustained. He must not have shot her in a crucial area of the brain when he had fired his gun at her head, or she was certain she wouldn't have recovered from that. She doubted he would make the same mistake again, so she zigged and zagged as she ran, but inevitably a bullet collided with her calf. She cursed and hobbled, thrown forward from the impact but not quite falling. At least not until he managed to shoot her in the back of the thigh, of the other leg. Lauren stumbled forward, landing heavily on her hands and knees. She tried to be agile when she turned around, hoping she could heal enough to get to her feet and keep running before he reached her, but she was significantly slowed by the injuries. She also seemed to be healing more slowly, which was probably a result of her body already having undertaken massive amounts of healing the past few days. It would explain her ravenous hunger too, but eating was the last thing on her mind at the moment. As he loomed over her, his gun centered on her face, she doubted he would allow her a last meal anyway. When she looked up at him, he looked rattled. "What the fuck are you, Sage?" She frowned at him. "I don't know what you mean." "You sure aren't human. Are you some kind of alien in disguise? Have they infiltrated our planet to that point, where even the department can't track or tell the difference? If so, it's going to be almost impossible to eradicate you." Her frown deepened. "Eradicate? What are you talking about, Felix? If you were a human, you'd understand. These aliens are coming to our planet and taking over everything. Most of them are technologically advanced compared to our society, and it's only a matter of time until they rise up and take over. We have to get rid of all the aliens before they enslave us. It's survival." Lauren shook her head. "I'm as human as you are. I don't have an explanation for the healing, other than Kerr shared some of his enzymes with me after the fire, and I assume I'm still feeling the effects of that. What you're talking about is genocide." His eyes gleamed. "Exactly. It will be genocide for our race if we don't do something before we reach a tipping point." "That's crazy talk. Most of the species on our planet are bound by the rules of the Interstellar Alliance. We're perfectly safe." Felix looked disgusted as he shook his head. "What you are is naive. It's coming, but there are those of us who don't want it to happen. We'll do anything to stop it, including using their own illegal technology to fund the fight against them." "You did all this to fund some terrorist groups? I thought it was for a far more pedestrian reason, getting rich." Felix shrugged a shoulder, though the gun didn't waver from her. "Getting rich is a nice side effect, but we have to have money for our goals. We can't all take over a planet and become rich from a freak show." Bitterness laced his words. She scuttled back a bit, freezing when the gun raised another millimeter, and his finger clearly tightened on the trigger. Do you specifically hate Kerr, or just everything he stands for? Her partner snorted. I hate them all, but I do have a special hatred for aliens like Kerr, that manipulate humans to build their wealth. When that she-boar spoke Kex's name for whatever reason, I saw an opportunity to bring them down. I didn't expect you to actually find anything that would help crack the case though, and you wouldn't have, if you hadn't searched the tent after I said I'd do it. That was unexpected. How does it feel to help betray your own kind, Sage? It's at our expense that he prospers, and you've helped further his agenda. I don't see it that way. He's providing entertainment in exchange for remuneration. How is that exploiting humanity? If anything, humans are exploiting them, though inadvertently. They believe they're viewing humans who have been mutated, and they're openly disdainful and mocking of their perceived differences. I don't have enough faith in humanity to believe that they would react any differently if they discovered they weren't actually mutated humans, but are rather aliens without mutations. They're blatantly lying to humans. So is the department. Everything is a lie, and they've taken away our choice about living alongside the freaks. Can't you see that? He shook his head, waving a hand vaguely in her direction. I don't know why I'm arguing with you. You're one of those bleeding heart types, and you're never going to see the risk until it's right in front of you. Then you'll wish you'd listened. He sighed. Actually, you won't have a chance to have any regrets. You have to go too. I might have found a way to spare you if it hadn't been for Ryota approaching you, but I'm left with no choice. There's always a choice that doesn't involve taking a life. He rolled his eyes. More of your bleeding heart crap. Genuine curiosity, coupled with the desire to distract him from his intended purpose of shooting her, as her mind raced for a solution, led her to ask, why did you kill Blorick? Isn't he one of your people? Felix grimaced. He's an alien. He had no idea about my people. He thought we were doing it to get rich, but when he decided to use the Diesel grenades to rob a bank, he had to be eliminated. I couldn't trust him. I eventually would have had to kill him anyway, to tie up any loose ends, but I would have used him for as long as possible if he hadn't gotten greedy and decided to strike out on his own. And Anasta? She already knew why he had killed Anasta, but she hoped he would answer. He seemed to want to talk, almost as though he were reluctant to shoot her, or perhaps he simply wanted to brag and explain his motivations. I'm sure you know why I shot her. She knew about Blorick, and she suspected his connection was someone high-ranking in the department, since the sales were buried for so long, and someone with a direct connection had to be able to supply the technology. Ryota was the one who figured out it was me though, but that didn't happen until she saw me speaking to Blorick. I had hoped to deal with her in a subtler fashion, but then she went to you to free to Lunta. I had to act before she told you everything. Then I heard the conversation with the director, and there was no choice. I had to do it then. Taking a stab in the dark, she asked, and why did you arrange to nearly kill me with the stage light on my first performance if you really wanted to spare me? He gave her a look that suggested he found the question as stupid as she was. I wanted you to find the place hostile, so you'd remain on your guard. The light was never designed to actually kill you, or even injure you. It was meant to scare you into trusting none of the aliens. I had high hopes for you, Lauren. I saw a spark of promise in you, and I hoped I could recruit you to our way of thinking, but I see that's impossible. While he'd been speaking, her legs had slowly healed. The bullets had ejected from her body, and though she could still feel an open wound on her calf and a depression in her thigh, she thought she might be able to run again. She dug her hands into the ground beside her, grasping a handful of dirt as she prepared herself. You're right for the first time all day. There is absolutely no way I'd join your people." As she spoke, she lifted her hand and threw the dirt right in his face. He coughed and sputtered, blinking his eyes, but she didn't wait around to see how distracted it made him. She got to her feet, and though the first few steps were shaky, she was soon running again. She must have temporarily obscured his vision, because his shots seemed wilder than they had, going wide. None of them hit her, and he cursed as the bullets ceased firing. He must have run out of ammo and was changing his magazine. It bought her a few precious extra seconds, though she didn't know what she'd do with them. There was nowhere to run and nothing around. She was in a forested area, running parallel to the clearing near the river. She plunged into the forest blindly, wincing as branches tugged at her, whipping against her skin and occasionally lacerating it. She paused near a tree which had convenient handholds in the form of natural knots in the trunk. With more luck than grace, she scaled the trunk and hid in the upper branches. Lauren tried to still her breathing as she watched the field, holding her breath as Felix grew ever closer. He was about to enter the forest when a roar reverberated in the air around her. She looked above Felix's head, her heart leaping with excitement and a little fear on his behalf, as she saw Kerr plunging downward. Felix lifted his gun, probably getting off at least 1 or 2 good shots, but Kerr didn't slow. He grabbed hold of Felix and wrenched the gun from his hand, tossing it far away before lifting the agent with him. Her former partner was screaming and trying to pull away until he realized how high he was. Then he was clinging to Kerr. Her lover seemed to take particular delight in prying Felix's hands from his arms and letting him fall from a height of at least 20 feet. Felix moaned when he hit the ground, indicating he wasn't dead yet. Lauren retraced her steps, scrambling from the tree as quickly as she could. She pushed through the forest and emerged into the field again, moving toward Felix as Kerr landed beside him. She looked around for his gun, but it wasn't in sight. She would have felt better having it in her hand, but between Kerr standing beside her and Felix's obvious injuries, she didn't need the weapon. "I need his communicator. It's probably in one of his pockets, if you don't mind." She couldn't bring herself to search Felix or get that close to him. She was embarrassed to admit it, but part of her was still afraid of what he might do. She was shaky and weak from the toll healing had taken on her, and she wasn't in top form to deal with Felix if he was less injured than he seemed to be. Either he was great at playing possum, or he truly was severely injured, because he didn't even put up a flicker of protest when Kerr searched his pockets before revealing the communicator, which he passed over to Lauren. She took it and called headquarters, relaying events as quickly as possible when she was on a secure connection with the director. The team would arrive shortly, and she disconnected the communicator and held it in her hand, since her pajamas lacked pockets. She looked to Kerr, who still seemed to be angry, but not quite so enraged. Her gaze moved quickly to Felix, who was breathing and moving slightly, obviously going nowhere by himself. "How did you find me?" "I heard you calling for me." She frowned. "I don't understand. I left my communicator in your trailer." Kerr shook his head. "I heard you in here." He tapped the side of his head lightly. "That happens with bondmates." Lauren frowned in her confusion. "I really don't understand now. Are you saying we're bondmates?" He nodded, though his expression was on the grim side. "It wasn't deliberate, but between sharing our blood and mating, we've become bondmates. There's an aspect of genetic compatibility involved, but it's more than that. In Dragoran society, it's almost a mystical connection. There's definitely an element of divine selection." Her head was throbbing, and she wasn't entirely certain if it was from trying to follow the conversation, or remnants of the headache she'd had since waking after Felix had shot her through the skull. "Does that mean we're married or something?" He hesitated for a moment, before shrugging. It's a stronger bond than that. I suspected it when you healed so quickly, after you'd been burned. I knew in my heart but didn't want to admit it yet, when you healed from Talunta stabbing you. The healing enzymes in my blood would have hastened the burn's healing, but not so rapidly. They most certainly wouldn't have lasted more than a few hours at most. If it wasn't your enzymes that healed me, then how did I heal? My DNA must have bonded with yours. Generations ago, our scientists unlocked the Draconian genome and fortified ourselves to achieve perfection. Whenever they encounter a disease or perceived defect, they alter the cell to reach a homeostatic state. I suspect we bonded on that level, or at least your DNA bonded with mine. My DNA would have perceived weaknesses in your immune system as requiring repair, so you incorporated part of me into your DNA. On my planet, a bonding ceremony involved an exchange of blood before physical consummation of the union. We followed all the necessary steps to be considered bondmates. Her head was reeling from the knowledge he imparted, and she shook her head. You don't want that. She said the words instinctively, realizing as she uttered them that his confirmation was going to ravage her. She shouldn't want such a connection either, but she did. Why bother denying it, or pretending otherwise? The connection he described was appealing, even though it was impossible. He was still loyal to his dead mate, and she was an agent with the department. A relationship between them couldn't work. It's not that I don't want you, Lauren. I do, but I feel like I'm betraying Philandria. She's dead and I'm alive. Would your mate want you to be miserable and alone for the rest of your life, if she knew you had the possibility of finding a new bondmate? He seemed to mull over her question, but had no time to formulate a response as the team arrived. After that it was chaos as a medical team assessed first Felix and then herself, and 4 agents arrested Felix. Somehow, Lauren found herself separated from Kerr and bundled into the helicopter to fly back for debriefing. As the chopper lifted off and flew away, she stared at him with longing, and in an attempt to memorize his face. At that moment, she was certain she would never see him again. Chapter 10. After debriefing and a medical exam, which confirmed her DNA had now been modified and contained fragments of Draconian DNA, she was placed on administrative leave for a week. It was standard procedure, since the conclusion of the investigation had implicated a fellow agent, and there had been an agent-on-agent shooting, though she had recovered. She believed the director when she stated Lauren would be back to work in no time, and she was actually relieved to have a few days off to gather her thoughts and process everything that had happened. The week passed with miserable slowness, and her heart jumped in her chest every time her phone rang, though she hadn't given Kerr her phone number. She had a new phone now, since the other had been destroyed in the fire, but her number was the same. It didn't matter, because she'd never given it to him. Even if she had, she was certain he wouldn't have used it, but that didn't keep her heart from racing with anticipation each time the ringtone sounded. She had a similar reaction the few times someone knocked on her door, even when it was food she had ordered, and could be no one else but the delivery person. Mostly, she stayed home and avoided the outside world, nursing a broken heart, and trying not to cling to the hope Kerr was experiencing the same thing. At the end of the week, the director called to put her back on active duty, starting Monday. As the weekend drew to a close and she prepared for work, she tried to push aside her hopes and disappointment related to Kerr. The assignment was over, and that part of her life was done as well. There would be no more exhilarating stage performances, and there certainly wouldn't be further nights of passion in his bed. It was best to move on and forget about it, to consign it all as part of the case, and try to focus on the future instead of the past. That way of thinking got her through the first 3 days of the week, but she was miserable. No amount of mental pep talks, or even ruthless reminders that he didn't want her, could assuage her misery. She was simply going through the motions, but she hoped if she embraced the expected path long enough, it would start to feel natural once more. She was afraid part of her would never feel whole again, but she could at least function and pretend like she was. She just needed more time to get to that point. 1,000 years should be long enough. The thought made her stumble on her way home as she walked to her apartment. 1,000, she whispered the words softly. Did she have 1,000 years? How old was Kerr, and how much had his DNA lengthened her lifespan? The idea of living far past most humans was more depressing than exhilarating, especially if it meant living like this, with half of her heart torn out of her chest. She fumbled with her key, wondering if she should call Kerr to ask him, or perhaps she could find the answer herself in the department archives. She was so distracted by her thoughts, finally having a real goal to focus on with her research, that it took her a moment to realize she wasn't alone in her apartment. She dropped the keys, and her hand went to her sidearm, but fell away a moment later when Kerr coalesced from the late afternoon shadows in her living room, his form becoming visible. She clutched her heart instead, taking a deep breath. "You scared the life out of me." His lips curved slightly. "I'm sorry. I would have waited for you to get home before letting myself in, but standing around in public spaces tends to be a problem for me." She nodded. "How did you get in?" "I landed on your fire escape and let myself in through the window." Lauren nodded again. "And why are you here?" It was a blunt, almost unfriendly question, but she needed the answer. "I'm here for you." Hope swelled in her, threatening to burst her chest open, when she took a shaky step toward him. "What exactly do you want from me?" "The rest of our lives together." Her lips trembled as she crossed another step. He did the same, and they were finally within touching distance of each other. She couldn't bring herself to lift her hand though. "How long might that be?" He shrugged. "A long time. Our DNA adaptations can deal with most diseases and injuries. We'll eventually die, but it could be centuries." She swallowed the lump in her throat. "I see. That's a long time to be together." He shook his head. She frowned. "We won't be together?" He shook his head again. "I meant it's not a long time. It's not nearly long enough. I'm sorry. When the comet collided with my planet, I was on another planet as part of a diplomatic mission. We were doing a performance for prospective allies when word came that the planet was about to be destroyed. I'm sure our scientists knew, but didn't tell anyone because of panic. Some people evacuated and made it off the planet, and others from colonies nearby had more time to flee before the rubble hit them after the planet's destruction, but my bondmate wasn't among them. I've always blamed myself for being away from her when it happened. I should have brought her along, or I should have stayed with her. I loved Philandria. I still do, but I love you too. It's a different kind of love, but no less intense. Very few Dragorans are lucky enough to have two bondmates in their lifetime. It just took me a little while to realize I was blessed, and you were right." She tilted her head slightly. "Right about what?" He smiled. "Philandria wouldn't have wanted me to be alone and unhappy if I had an opportunity to find another bondmate. She would have wanted me to be loved and content. I'm certain she would have approved of you, and of our union." Though she had never met Philandria, his words were oddly comforting. She could choose to view his dead mate as a rival, or she could graciously accept he had once loved someone deeply, and see the integrity it took to maintain that level of devotion for however long they had been apart. She understood his confusion now, and she allowed herself to feel hopeful. Are you sure about this? We skipped a lot of steps to reach this point, and I think we're going to have to go back and fill in some of them. We need to get better acquainted, but if you're not sure about this level of commitment, maybe it's better if we go our separate ways now. The idea nearly killed her, and she was easily reminded of the miserable week she'd spent without him thus far. Could it hurt any worse if he changed his mind after they had gotten closer? She didn't know, but she had to make at least one last attempt to protect herself and be certain he was sure. Kerr lifted his arms, wrapping them around her as he pulled her closer. His embrace was like heaven, and his lips hadn't even touched hers yet. I'm positive I want to be with you. I've worked out the issues that were holding me back. Do you want to be with me? She nodded. That was one thing she didn't have to think about. The last week had shown her that. Very much so. I just don't want to get my heart broken. His arms tightened around her, and he pressed a kiss to her forehead before replying. I'll never deliberately hurt you. You're my bondmate, it's both my duty and privilege to take care of you and love you. I can take care of myself, she said softly, but with a smile. The idea of allowing you to assist me with that sounds pretty good though. He smiled before his head descended, his mouth taking possession of hers for several long moments. They didn't speak, letting their kisses do all the talking until they both broke away, breathing heavily. What about your job? She hesitated for a moment before licking her lips. People commute all the time, and I happen to know someone who can fly me wherever I need to be. I won't always be able to travel with you, but we'll spend more days together than apart, I'm sure. Her answer seemed to satisfy him, and he lifted her into his arms. Let's go home then. She snuggled against him as he moved toward the balcony, clearly preparing to fly from the fire escape. Anyone who saw it would certainly talk, but she wasn't terribly concerned about that at the moment. She simply wanted to get back to the Grotesquerie. Home. She'd been away from him for too long, but would never do it again. There would be assignments that would take her away from him, and she would definitely have to come back to testify at Felix's trial in front of the tribunal, as they decided whether to banish him or give him a lifetime in prison on Earth, but she was confident there would be no more permanent separations from her mate. Their bond was unshakable, and their future was secure. This has been Grotesquerie, a science fiction mystery by A.I.I.D.